I stood at my parents' door on Christmas Eve holding a gift I knew they'd never open. Through the frosted glass, I could see golden lights, champagne glasses, and the family I'd been erased from. When my mother answered, her face didn't soften. It hardened. "What are you doing here?" My father appeared behind her, blocking the doorway like a bouncer at an exclusive club. "Members only." He smirked, his voice dripping with contempt. My mother's laugh cut deeper than the winter wind. "You can't even afford your own meal, Felicia. Why would we want you here?" I'd spent 37 years invisible to these people. The forgotten daughter, the family ATM, the one who sacrificed everything while my perfect sister got everything. They didn't know I'd become the most successful property developer in the state. They didn't know I'd built an empire from the ashes of the debt they'd buried me under. And they definitely didn't know I owned the hard estate, the $10 million country club they'd been desperately trying to join for 6 months. I turned to leave, accepting this final rejection, when a black car pulled up. My assistant stepped out. "Ms. Hart, the board is waiting." My father's face shifted from smug to confused. "How do you know about—" I smiled for the first time that night. "Because I own it, Dad. And your membership application denied." What happened next? Let's just say this Christmas I didn't give gifts, I gave lessons. And by the end of this story, my family learned that the daughter they threw away became the one woman they should have never underestimated. This is how I took back everything they stole and so much more. My name is Felicia Hart. I'm 37 years old, and I own one of the most exclusive country clubs in the state, though most people don't know that. For years, I've kept my success quiet, built my empire in the shadows, because I learned early that being underestimated is sometimes your greatest advantage. I'm a commercial real estate developer, self-made, with a portfolio worth more than most people see in a lifetime. But none of that matters when you're standing outside your childhood home on Christmas Eve, holding a gift for parents who haven't spoken to you in 7 years. The silver wrapping paper caught the porch light as I raised my hand to ring the doorbell. My fingers trembled, not from the cold, though snow had begun to fall in soft, fat flakes, but from the weight of hope I'd been carrying for weeks. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe enough time had passed. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me as something other than the daughter who wasn't good enough, the one they could forget without consequence. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I could see everything I'd been excluded from. Warm, golden light spilled from the chandelier in the entryway. I heard laughter, my uncle's booming voice, my aunt's high-pitched giggle, the clink of champagne glasses. A Christmas party in full swing, the kind my parents threw every year to impress their friends and neighbors. The kind I used to help set up when I was younger, before I became invisible to them. I pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside, and I watched shadows move behind the frosted glass. Footsteps approached. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. I would be gracious. I would be kind. I would show them that despite everything, I was still their daughter, still willing to try. The door opened, and my mother stood there in a burgundy cocktail dress I didn't recognize, diamonds at her throat. I knew my father couldn't really afford. Patricia Hart had always been beautiful in that carefully maintained way, hair colored to hide the gray makeup applied with precision, every detail controlled. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw surprise flicker across her face. Then it hardened into something cold and unwelcoming. "What are you doing here?" Her voice carried no warmth, no curiosity, just irritation. She didn't step aside. She didn't smile. She held the door like a barrier between her world and mine. "Mom." My voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "It's Christmas Eve. I hoped maybe we could—" "Richard," she called over her shoulder, not even letting me finish. "Richard, come here." Inside, I could see the dining room where the long table was set with china I remembered from childhood. My father appeared from that direction, still holding the carving knife, a white apron tied over his dress shirt. Richard Hart had aged since I'd last seen him, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his mouth, but his eyes held the same dismissive coldness they always had when he looked at me. "We didn't set a place for you," he said flatly, his voice carrying across the entryway loud enough for everyone inside to hear. Conversations stopped. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes turn toward the doorway, though I couldn't see them clearly. "This is a private family gathering." The words hit like a physical blow. Private family gathering. As if I wasn't family. As if 37 years of being their daughter could be erased by 7 years of silence they had initiated. My sister Emily appeared behind my father wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was 33 now, still beautiful, still the favored one. She looked at me with something between pity and satisfaction, and a small smirk played at the corner of her mouth. She didn't say anything she didn't have to. Her presence there, comfortable and included, said everything about the family hierarchy that had never changed. My father moved toward the door, positioning himself beside my mother. Together, they formed a wall. "You don't belong in this house anymore, Felicia," he said, and I hated how steady his voice was, how certain. "You made your choices. You walked away from this family. You can't just show up when it's convenient and expect us to welcome you back." The accusation was so backwards it almost made me laugh. I hadn't walked away, they'd pushed me out, forgotten me, used me until there was nothing left to take. But standing there on their porch with snow falling around me and my hands still clutching a gift they'd never open, I realized something they actually believed their own version of history. They'd rewritten the past so thoroughly that they were the victims and I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned them. I could have argued. I could have reminded them of every birthday they'd forgotten, every achievement they'd ignored every time they'd chosen Emily over me without hesitation. I could have told them about the debt they'd left me with the 3 jobs I'd worked to pay it off, the years I'd struggled while they lived in willful ignorance of what they'd done. But I didn't. Instead, I simply nodded. My face remained calm, composed, even as something inside me finally irrevocably broke. I set the silver-wrapped gift on the entrance table beside a vase of flowers. They could open it or throw it away, I no longer cared which. I met my father's eyes one last time and saw nothing there that resembled love or even basic human kindness. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly and turned to leave. I heard the door close behind me before I'd even stepped off the porch. No goodbye, no hesitation, just the firm click of a lock sliding into place. The walk to my car felt endless. Snow fell heavier now, catching in my hair, melting against my cheeks, where it mixed with the single tear I couldn't hold back. The Christmas lights on neighboring houses blurred into streaks of gold and red and green. I reached my car, a sleek black Mercedes they probably assumed I couldn't afford, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out with numb fingers and read the text from David, my assistant. "Ms. Hart, the board meeting starts in 30 minutes. They're waiting for you at the club." The club, the Hart estate. The $10 million property I'd purchased 18 months ago and transformed into the most exclusive, prestigious country club in the state. The same club my parents had been trying desperately to join, their application sitting on my desk, awaiting my approval. I started the engine, turned up the heat, and pulled away from the house where I'd grown up, feeling invisible. I didn't look back at the warm lights or the family that had never really been mine. I drove toward the place where everyone knew my name, where my word was law, where I'd built something extraordinary from nothing. And as I drove through the falling snow, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even hurt anymore, just clarity. Cold, perfect clarity about exactly who my parents were and what they deserved. They wanted to be part of an exclusive club. They wanted prestige and status and the validation that came from being accepted into elite circles. Well, I owned the gates they were trying so desperately to enter. And tonight, after years of being powerless in my own family, I finally held all the power. The drive from my parents' house to the Hart estate took 23 minutes through increasingly heavy snowfall, but I barely noticed the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, and my mind kept replaying that moment at the door, my father's cold dismissal, my mother's refusal to even step aside, Emily's satisfied smirk. By the time I turned onto the private road leading to the club, I'd cycled through hurt and anger and landed somewhere closer to numb determination. The entrance to the Hart estate always took my breath away, even now, even after 18 months of ownership. The wrought iron gates swung open automatically as my car approached, recognizing the vehicle. Beyond them, the circular driveway curved through perfectly manicured grounds dusted with fresh snow that looked almost magical under strategically placed landscape lighting. Tonight, despite the weather, luxury cars lined both sides, Range Rovers, Mercedes BMWs, even a Bentley near the entrance. My members didn't let a little snow stop them from their holiday gatherings. I pulled into my reserved spot near the main entrance, marked discreetly with a small brass plaque that simply read, Owner. As I stepped out of my car, straightening my coat and brushing snow from my shoulders, the valet rushed over with an umbrella. "Good evening, Ms. Hart," he said warmly. Marcus was a college student working his way through school, and I made sure all my employees earned fair wages with full benefits. "Big crowd tonight for the holiday reception." "Thank you, Marcus. How's your final exam schedule looking?" I asked, because I actually cared about my employees as human beings, not just labor. His face lit up. "Last one's tomorrow, then I'm done for the semester. Thank you for asking, Ms. Hart." I walked toward the entrance, and the doorman James, who'd been with the club for 30 years under previous ownership, opened the heavy mahogany door with a respectful nod. "Welcome back, owner. The board members arrived about 10 minutes ago." "Thank you, James." I stepped into the marble-floored foyer and immediately felt the atmosphere shift around me. This was my world, the one I'd built from nothing, the place where I wasn't invisible or forgotten or dismissed. The main hall stretched before me like something from a classical estate, marble floors, polished to mirror brightness, soaring ceilings with ornate molding twin staircases curving upward to the second floor. Tonight it was decorated for the holidays with tasteful elegance, fresh garlands of pine and eucalyptus draped along the balustrade, white lights twinkling like stars, arrangements of white roses and red amaryllis on accent tables. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the air smelled of pine and expensive perfume. Members moved through the space in evening wear, cocktail dresses, and tailored suits, holding wine glasses and conversing in the modulated tones of people who'd never had to raise their voices to be heard. Several nodded respectfully as I passed. "Evening, Ms. Hart? Lovely decorations this year? Wonderful event." They knew who I was, knew I controlled this space, yet I'd cultivated relationships based on mutual respect rather than intimidation. I'd learned that real power didn't require you to constantly remind people you had it. Mrs. Pemberton, a 72-year-old philanthropist who'd been one of my first members, stopped me near the grand staircase. "Felicia, dear, I wanted to thank you again for hosting our charity auction last month. We raised over $200,000 for the Children's Hospital." "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Pemberton. That's exactly what this space should be used for, bringing people together for meaningful purposes." I meant it. The Hart estate wasn't just about exclusivity for exclusivity's sake. I'd worked hard to build a community that actually contributed something positive to the world, not just a playground for the wealthy to show off. I excused myself and made my way through the west corridor toward my private office, past the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, past the smaller dining rooms where intimate gatherings took place. My heels clicked against marble, then softened as I stepped onto the plush carpet runner leading to the administrative wing. David was already in my office when I arrived, standing near the window that overlooked the grounds, reviewing something on his tablet. David Chen had been my assistant for 5 years, following me from my property development company when I'd acquired the club. He was 31, brilliant, discreet, and loyal in a way I'd learned not to take for granted. He looked up when I entered, his expression shifting from professional calm to something gentler when he saw my face. "Rough night?" he asked quietly, because he knew where I'd been and why. About what I expected, I said, setting my purse down and removing my coat. Let's focus on the meeting. What do I need to know? David pulled up his notes, falling into professional mode seamlessly. The board wants to discuss the proposed expansion of the golf course and the budget for next year's capital improvements. Peterson is going to push for the new tennis courts again, and Williams has concerns about... David. I interrupted him gently, sitting down behind my desk. I know you prepared thoroughly. You always do. But first tell me about the membership applications. You mentioned there were several pending... He hesitated just for a moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Concern, maybe, or anticipation. He'd been with me long enough to know my history, or at least the outline of it. I'd never told him everything, but David was observant. He'd pieced together enough. Yes, he said carefully. We have 12 applications currently under review. Most are straightforward good references, appropriate financial standing, no red flags. But there are a few that require your personal attention. He walked to my desk and placed a burgundy folder in front of me marked with a small label, Priority Applications, December. I stared at that folder for a long moment before opening it. My hands, which had trembled holding that Christmas gift on my parents' porch, were steady now. This was my domain. This was where I had control. I opened the folder, and my breath caught in my throat. Right there, clipped to the top of the stack with a standard application form, were two names typed in neat administrative font, Mr. Richard Hart and Mrs. Patricia Hart. My parents. Their application was dated 6 months ago, July 15th. They'd been on the waiting list all this time, waiting for approval they had no idea would cross my desk. The application was thorough, professionally completed. I scanned the details with detached fascination. My father's occupation listed as retired manufacturing consultant, which was a generous interpretation of unemployment. My mother's volunteer activities listed prominently all the right charitable boards, all the right social organizations, letters of recommendation from people whose names I recognized from the local business community. And at the bottom in the section asking why they wished to join the Hart estate, my mother had written in her precise handwriting, "We have worked our entire lives to achieve the social standing appropriate for membership in an institution of this caliber. The Hart estate represents the pinnacle of excellence and exclusivity in our community, and we believe our values align perfectly with the club's distinguished reputation." I almost laughed. Values. They had no idea the club was named Hart, because that was my name, the one I'd reclaimed and made into something they could never tarnish. David stood quietly waiting. When I finally looked up at him, his expression was carefully neutral, professional, but I saw the question in his eyes. "They've been on the list for 6 months," I asked, my voice steady. "Yes, we typically process applications within 3 months, but their file was flagged for owner review due to the surname match. I've been holding it, waiting for the right time to bring it to your attention." The right time. Tonight felt like fate, being rejected at their door, then coming here to find their future in my hands. David asked quietly, his voice gentle but direct, "Shall I approve their membership application, Ms. Hart, or would you prefer to decline it?" I didn't answer David immediately. Instead, I stared at my parents' application, and suddenly I wasn't 37 anymore, sitting in my elegant office with power and success surrounding me. I was 8 years old again, standing in the kitchen doorway watching my mother frost a cake for Emily's birthday party, while my own birthday 3 days earlier had passed without acknowledgement. The memories came flooding back, uninvited but unstoppable, each one a small cut that had never quite healed. I'd been the responsible one from the beginning. While Emily threw tantrums and broke things and demanded constant attention, I learned quickly that good behavior earned nothing but expectation. I brought home straight A's on every report card from first grade onward, and my father would glance at it briefly before saying, "Well, that's what we expect from you, Felicia." Meanwhile, Emily's C- in math would prompt a family celebration dinner because she tried so hard, and improvement should be rewarded. By middle school, I'd stopped showing them my achievements altogether. I was captain of the debate team, won the regional science fair, made the honor roll every single semester. I organized my own parent-teacher conferences because they consistently forgot to attend, making excuses to my teachers about work conflicts that didn't exist. The truth was simpler and more painful. They were at Emily's dance recitals, her chorus concerts, her drama rehearsals. Emily was 11, then already beautiful in that effortless way some people are, with long dark hair and expressive eyes that made adults coo over her. She had star quality, everyone said. She lit up a room. I apparently did not light up rooms. I was just competent, reliable, useful Felicia who required no attention because she never caused problems. The pattern continued through high school. I remember my 13th birthday with particular clarity because it was the day I truly understood how invisible I was to them. I woke up excited, expecting at least a card at breakfast, maybe a small gift. Instead, I found my mother in Emily's room, worried because my 10-year-old sister had a mild cold. "Felicia, you'll need to get yourself to school today," my mother said without looking at me. "Emily needs me here." I waited all day for someone to remember. That evening, I came home to find my mother making chicken soup for Emily, who was watching television in her pajamas, perfectly fine. My father came home from work, asked how Emily was feeling, and never once looked at me. They'd forgotten entirely. I went to my room and cried silently into my pillow, already trained not to make my pain anyone else's problem. My high school graduation should have been a triumph. I was valedictorian, giving the commencement speech to an audience of hundreds. I'd written and rewritten that speech for weeks, wanting it to be perfect. My parents arrived 20 minutes late, slipping into seats at the back just as I was being introduced. I saw them from the podium and felt a surge of relief they'd made it after all. I delivered my speech about perseverance and believing in yourself, scanning the audience for their faces, hoping to see pride. When the ceremony ended and I found them in the crowd, my father looked at his watch immediately. "We need to leave soon," he said. "Emily's drama rehearsal starts in 45 minutes and she has the lead role. We promised we'd be there." They stayed for exactly 12 minutes of the reception, long enough to take one photo with me in my cap and gown, then left. I stood alone among my celebrating classmates, watching my parents' car pull away. The Stanford acceptance letter arrived in April of my senior year. I'd worked so hard for it. Perfect grades, extracurriculars, volunteer work, essays I'd revised 20 times. I ran into the house with the envelope, my hands shaking with excitement, and found my parents in the living room going over finances. "I got in," I said, breathless and happy. "I got into Stanford." My father barely looked up from the spreadsheet in front of him. "Well, someone has to pay for it yourself," he said flatly. "We're investing in Emily's arts education. She's been accepted to the National Dance Academy, and that's $40,000 a year. You're smart, Felicia. You'll figure out the loans." My mother nodded in agreement, already turning back to their financial planning. Neither of them said congratulations. Neither of them acknowledged that Stanford was an extraordinary achievement. They simply made it clear that my dreams were my own problem, while Emily's dreams were a family investment. But the wound that cut deepest came a few months later at a family barbecue at my uncle's house. I was in the kitchen helping my aunt with dishes when I heard my father's voice from the patio talking to Uncle James. I don't think he knew I could hear him through the open window. "Felicia's useful," he said, his tone matter-of-fact as if discussing a moderately reliable appliance. "She'll go to college, probably get some stable job work for someone else her whole life. She's not exceptional, just competent. But Emily is special. She has that star quality you can't teach. She's going to do something remarkable. Felicia will probably just end up being ordinary. She'll never be good enough to really stand out." I stood frozen at the sink, soapy water dripping from my hands, those words branding themselves into my brain. Never good enough to stand out. Ordinary. Useful, but not special. I was 17 years old, and my own father had just declared my future mediocre and unremarkable while in the same breath promising my sister would shine. Something changed in me that day. The part of me that had still been trying to earn their love, still hoping that one more achievement might make them see me, finally died. In its place grew something harder, more determined. I would prove him wrong. I would become so successful, so remarkable, so impossible to ignore that his words would haunt him forever. That night I wrote in the diary I'd kept since I was 10 years old. My handwriting was angry, the pen pressing hard enough to indent the pages underneath. One day they'll realize what they lost, and I'll never need them again. I'd kept that promise to myself for 20 years. Despite that vow I'd made to myself at 17, I spent the next several years still trying to earn what should have been freely given. Love in my family was something you had to work for, sacrifice for, prove you deserved. And I kept believing that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, eventually they'd see me. When I was 16, I got my first real job waitressing at a diner called Mel's on the edge of town. I worked Friday nights, Saturdays and Sunday mornings, coming home smelling like grease and coffee, my feet aching and my pockets full of dollar bills and loose change. During the week, I tutored 3 kids from wealthy families in math and English, charging $20 an hour, money that felt enormous to me then. I'd deposit my paychecks and tutoring cash into my savings account and watch the balance grow with a sense of accomplishment that nobody at home ever acknowledged. Emily had started serious ballet training that year, and it was expensive. The classes, the shoes that wore out every few months, the special costumes for recitals, the competition entry fees, it all added up to hundreds of dollars monthly. My parents sat me down one evening and explained that I needed to contribute. Family duty. My father called it, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The oldest must help the youngest succeed. That's how families work, Felicia. Emily has real talent, a real future in dance. She needs our support right now. My mother nodded along, already planning Emily's competition schedule. I was expected to hand over most of my earnings, keeping only enough for school lunches and basic necessities. I wore the same 6 outfits to school in rotation, mostly hand-me-downs from a neighbor whose daughter had outgrown them. I watched other girls my age get new clothes for the start of each season, carry designer purses, wear jewelry their parents bought them. I told myself material things didn't matter, that I was building character through sacrifice. I convinced myself that my parents would eventually recognize how selfless I was being, how I was putting Emily's dreams above my own comfort. Surely that kind of devotion meant something. Surely they'd eventually look at me with the same pride and love they showed Emily. They never did. Emily's ballet success became the center of our household, and I was just the machinery that helped fund it, invisible, except when my labor was needed. The Stanford situation broke something in me, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. When that acceptance letter arrived with the partial scholarship offer, I'd felt pure joy for approximately 5 minutes. Stanford wanted me. One of the best universities in the country had looked at my application and deemed me worthy. The scholarship covered half the tuition, and I'd need roughly $30,000 per year for the remaining costs, plus room and board. It seemed possible, achievable with loans and part-time work. I approached my parents that evening with the letter in hand and a spreadsheet I'd prepared showing different financial scenarios. I'd done my research, found information about federal student loans, work-study programs, payment plans. I just needed them to help me understand which option made the most sense, maybe co-sign a reasonable loan to supplement the federal aid. My father was reading the newspaper in his recliner, still in his work clothes. I stood in front of him holding out the acceptance letter, trying to keep the hope out of my voice because hope always made disappointment hurt worse. Dad, I need to talk to you about Stanford. I got in with a scholarship and I've been looking at the costs. He didn't even take the letter from my hand. He glanced at it briefly, then back to his newspaper. We can't afford it, Felicia. Emily needs to attend the National Dance Academy next year. That's $40,000 annually, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for her. You're smart. You'll figure out the loans, or you can go to community college for 2 years and transfer. Stanford isn't going anywhere. My mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I looked at her silently, begging her to advocate for me to say that maybe both daughters deserved investment in their futures. Instead, she said gently, as if her reasonableness made the rejection less cruel. Stanford will always be there, honey. Emily's window for professional dance is closing. She's 17 now, and if she doesn't pursue this seriously in the next few years, she'll have missed her chance. You understand, don't you? You're the responsible one. We know you'll find a way. I nodded because that's what I always did. I understood. I was responsible. I would find a way. I went to my room, researched student loans for hours, and began the process of borrowing money that would take me over a decade to repay. I told myself I was being mature, independent, not a burden on my parents. The truth I couldn't face yet was simpler. I wasn't worth investing in. I worked 3 jobs through college campus library weekend catering gigs and summer internships that barely paid but looked good on my resume. I graduated with honors and $80,000 in debt, the weight of it following me like a shadow into my adult life. When I came home that first summer after graduation, exhausted and uncertain about my future, I was still foolish enough to seek their approval. My father caught me alone one afternoon in the kitchen. He'd been struggling with his small manufacturing business, and I knew from overhearing arguments that money was tight. He sat down across from me at the table and explained that he was expanding the company, taking out a loan to purchase new equipment that would increase production capacity. "The bank needs a co-signer," he said, meeting my eyes with an expression that almost looked vulnerable. "My credit took a hit from some missed payments a few years back." "You've got good credit now, right? Fresh out of college, student loans in good standing." I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "I need you to co-sign this business loan. It's just a formality, really. I'll make every payment on time. You're helping the family, Felicia. After everything we've done for you, raising you, giving you a home, this is how you can give back." Everything we've done for you. The phrase hung in the air between us, rewriting history, reframing basic parental obligations as favors I owed them for. I should have said no. Every instinct should have been screaming at me to refuse to protect myself, to finally put my own welfare first. But I was 22 and still desperately trying to prove my loyalty, still hoping that this sacrifice would be the one that finally made them value me. I signed the papers he slid across the table, barely reading the terms, trusting my father despite decades of evidence that trust was misplaced. 6 months later, a certified letter arrived at my tiny studio apartment. My hands shook as I opened it, somehow knowing before I read the words that my life was about to change in terrible ways. The bank informed me that Richard Hart had defaulted on the $150,000 loan, that he'd missed 3 consecutive payments, and that as co-signer, I was now legally responsible for the entire debt. I called my father immediately after reading that letter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice casual as if nothing unusual was happening. "Felicia, what is it? I'm in the middle of something." "Dad, the bank just sent me a letter. They're saying you defaulted on the loan, the one I co-signed." My voice was high and tight, panic threading through every word. "They're saying I'm responsible for $150,000. This has to be a mistake. You said you'd make the payments." There was a long silence. Then my father sighed, the sound heavy with irritation rather than guilt. "The business didn't work out the way I planned. These things happen in the real world, Felicia. You signed the papers. You're an adult. Figure it out." "Figure it out," I repeated, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "Dad, this is $150,000. I just graduated. I'm barely making enough to cover my own student loans and rent. You promised you'd handle this. I don't have time for this conversation." His tone was flat dismissive, the same voice he'd used my entire childhood when I'd tried to get his attention. "You wanted to be treated like an adult, so now you're being treated like one. Handle your responsibilities." The line went dead. He'd hung up on me. I called back immediately. It went to voicemail. I called again and again. By the 10th attempt, I realized he was deliberately ignoring me. I tried my mother next, hoping she'd be more reasonable, more sympathetic. She didn't answer either. I left 3 voicemails, each one more desperate than the last, begging someone to just talk to me, to explain what had happened. Finally, in desperation, I called Emily. She answered on the 2nd ring, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. She was at some party or gathering, living her carefree life funded by family money while I was drowning. Emily, thank God, something's happened with Dad's business loan and I need to understand. She cut me off with a laugh that made my blood run cold. Oh, that. Yeah, Dad mentioned you might call. Honestly, Felicia, that's what you get for always trying to be the hero. You signed the papers without even reading them properly. That's on you. Her voice was light, almost amused, as if my financial ruin was entertaining gossip. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to rescue everyone. Emily, I'm your sister. Doesn't that mean anything to you? You're the one who always acted like you were better than us, going off to your fancy college, being so independent. Well, congratulations. Now you really are independent. Good luck with that. She hung up before I could respond. I sat on the floor of my studio apartment, surrounded by the pieces of my shattered life, and something fundamental shifted inside me. The family I'd sacrificed everything for, the people I'd worked myself to exhaustion trying to please, had used me and then discarded me without a second thought. They weren't going to help. They weren't even going to pretend to care. So I stopped waiting for them to care. I stopped hoping. I stopped being the obedient daughter who believed sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. Instead, I got angry and I got strategic. For the next 3 years, I lived a life that would have broken most people. I worked as a receptionist at a law firm from 8 to 5, making barely enough to cover my basic expenses. Immediately after, I'd change clothes in the office bathroom and head to a bar downtown, where I worked from 6 until 2 in the morning serving drinks to people who had more money in their wallets than I made in a week. On weekends, I did freelance bookkeeping for small businesses, hunched over my laptop in coffee shops, eyes burning from exhaustion, entering numbers until they blurred together. I moved into a studio apartment with 2 roommates sleeping on a mattress on the floor in a corner we'd partitioned with a curtain. I ate ramen noodles and rice, splurging on eggs when I could afford protein. My wardrobe came entirely from thrift stores, and I learned to mend clothes myself because replacing them wasn't an option. I had no social life, no dating life, no hobbies or entertainment. Every single dollar beyond survival went to that debt, chipping away at the mountain my father had dumped on me. The financial burden was crushing, but the emotional weight of betrayal was somehow heavier. I'd spent 22 years believing that family meant something, that loyalty mattered, that love existed beneath the surface neglect. Now I understood the truth: my family had never loved me. They'd used me. I was a resource to be exploited, not a person to be valued. That realization could have destroyed me. Instead, it rebuilt me into something harder, sharper, more determined. I stopped reaching out entirely. When Emily got married 2 years into my debt servitude, I saw the photos on social media, the white dress, the elegant venue, my parents beaming with pride. I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even been told it was happening. I stared at those photos for a long time, looking at the family that had erased me so completely, and felt nothing but cold clarity. When my parents moved to a larger house in a better neighborhood, I learned about it from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it casually. They'd somehow found money for a down payment while I was working 3 jobs to clean up their mess. Not once did they call to ask how I was managing. Not once did they offer to help, or even acknowledge what they'd done to me. The silence between us became permanent, and strangely, I found peace in it. Without their voices in my head telling me I wasn't enough, I could finally hear my own voice telling me I was everything. I started going to the library on my rare free afternoons, devouring business strategy books, reading about real estate investment, studying successful entrepreneurs. I took free online courses in finance and marketing, building knowledge I'd use someday when I wasn't drowning. I made a new vow to myself during those dark years: I would become so successful, so powerful, so impossible to ignore that my family would choke on their regret. They'd thrown me away like garbage. I'd turn myself into gold. 3 years into this grueling existence, on a rainy Tuesday night, when I was so exhausted I could barely stand, something changed. The bar was nearly empty, just a few regulars nursing beers, and one distinguished older man in an expensive suit sitting alone at the end of the counter. I'd been on my feet for 18 hours straight, and every part of my body ached. I approached him to take his order, and he looked at me with unusual intensity, as if seeing something others missed. When I brought his whiskey, he spoke quietly, his voice measured and serious. "You're wasting extraordinary potential in this place, Ms. Hart." He'd read my name tag. "Let me offer you a real opportunity." I stared at the man, certain I'd misheard him over the noise of the bar's sound system. "I'm sorry, what?" He smiled slightly, the kind of expression that suggested he was used to people being caught off guard. "My name is Marcus Gray. I'm a real estate investor and developer, and I've been coming to this bar for the past 3 weeks specifically to observe you." He said it matter-of-factly, without any hint of impropriety. "I've watched how you handle difficult customers with patience and intelligence, how you remember regulars' preferences without writing them down, how you manage the chaos of a busy Friday night with remarkable efficiency. You have something most people lack: genuine competence combined with resilience. Those qualities are rare and valuable." I set down the glass I'd been holding, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You've been watching me for 3 weeks. Observing," he corrected gently. "There's a difference. I'm looking for an assistant, someone I can train and develop into a real business partner eventually. I need intelligence, trustworthiness, and hunger for something better. You clearly have all 3. He pulled a business card from his wallet and slid it across the bar. "I'm offering you $60,000 annually, full benefits including health insurance and a genuine education in how to build wealth through real estate investment and development. You'd work directly with me, learning the business from someone who's been doing it successfully for 30 years. I picked up the card, reading it in the dim bar light. Marcus Gray, Principal Gray Investment Properties. A downtown address in one of the expensive office buildings I'd walked past but never entered. This sounds too good to be true. What's the catch? The catch is that I'm demanding," he said honestly. "I expect excellence, commitment, and continuous learning. I'll push you hard because I see potential in you that's being wasted pouring drinks for drunk college students. But I'm also fair. I invest in my people. If you prove yourself, I'll pay for you to get your MBA. I'll teach you everything I know about property acquisition, development, financing, and management. In return, I expect loyalty and your absolute best effort." He finished his whiskey and stood, leaving 2 $20 bills on the bar for a $12 drink. "Research me this weekend. Look up my company, my properties, my reputation. If you're interested, come to my office Monday morning at 9. If not, I'll respect your decision, and we'll never speak of this again." He walked out into the rain, leaving me standing there with his business card in my trembling hand. I spent the entire weekend researching Marcus Gray. I barely slept, hunched over my laptop in the corner of the crowded apartment while my roommates complained about the glow from my screen. What I found was almost unbelievable. Marcus Gray was legitimate, more than legitimate. He owned a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across 3 states, valued at over $50 million. Articles in business journals praised his ethical approach to development, his ability to revitalize struggling neighborhoods without displacing existing residents. He'd been interviewed by major financial publications, spoken at real estate conferences, served on nonprofit boards. There were no scandals, no lawsuits, no red flags anywhere in his background. He was exactly what he claimed to be: a highly successful, respected businessman. Monday morning, I walked into his office building, wearing the only professional outfit I owned, a navy suit from a thrift store that I'd carefully steamed the night before. My heart pounded as the elevator rose to the 12th floor, terrified this would somehow fall through, that it was all an elaborate misunderstanding. Marcus's assistant greeted me warmly and showed me to his office, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He stood when I entered, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Ms. Hart, I'm pleased you came. Does this mean you're interested?" "I'm interested." I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I need to understand why." "Why me?" "You could hire someone with more experience, better education, actual credentials." Why offer this to a bartender you watched for 3 weeks?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because credentials can be taught, but character cannot. I've watched you maintain dignity while exhausted, treat difficult people with patience. You probably didn't feel work harder than anyone around you for less recognition. I've built my career on reading people. Ms. Hart and I see in you someone who's been knocked down but refuses to stay down. That's worth more than any MBA from someone who's never faced real adversity." He paused, and something flickered across his face, an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "And because you remind me of someone I once failed to help, someone who deserved better than what their family gave them. I can't change that situation, but perhaps I can change yours." I accepted his offer that day, and it transformed everything. For the next 7 years, Marcus Gray became my mentor teacher, and the closest thing to a real father I'd ever known. He was demanding in ways my actual father never had been. He expected excellence, pushed me past what I thought were my limits, refused to accept excuses or mediocrity. But unlike my father, Marcus's demands came from belief in my capabilities, not from dismissal of my worth. When I made mistakes, he taught me how to learn from them rather than punishing me. When I succeeded, he acknowledged it and immediately raised the bar, showing me I was capable of even more. He taught me how to evaluate properties, how to read financial statements and spot opportunities others missed, how to negotiate with sellers and contractors and banks. He paid for me to attend evening MBA classes, never complaining when my coursework meant longer hours. He took me to property viewings, letting me observe how he assessed buildings and neighborhoods, explaining his thought process. He introduced me to architects, developers, city planners, building a network around me that would prove invaluable. But more than technical skills, Marcus taught me something my family never had, that I was worthy of investment. He bought me professional clothing, appropriate for client meetings, explaining that appearance mattered in business, not because of vanity, but because it affected how seriously people took you. He corrected my posture and speech patterns, not to diminish me, but to help me project the confidence I was still learning to feel. He celebrated my achievements genuinely, the way a parent should celebrate a child's success. Our relationship remained professional, but warmth existed beneath the formality. He never pried into my personal life, but somehow knew when I was struggling with more than work stress. On particularly difficult days, he'd extend our lunch meetings talking about philosophy or history or anything that gave me a mental break from whatever was weighing on me. I never understood why he'd chosen me, specifically, why he'd invested so much in someone with no credentials or connections. Whenever I asked, he'd give versions of the same answer. I reminded him of someone he'd failed to help. I assumed he meant a former employee or perhaps a child he'd never had. It never occurred to me that the connection was deeper, more personal, rooted in family history I didn't know existed. What I didn't know, what Marcus never told me, was that he kept a faded photograph in his desk drawer face down so he wouldn't have to look at it every day, but present enough that he never forgot. A photograph from 1965 showing 2 young men in their early 20s, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the optimism of people who believed family was forever. One of those men was Marcus himself, then known as Gregory Hart. The other was his cousin Richard, before bitterness and failure had hardened him into the man who would one day destroy his own daughter's trust, just as thoroughly as the family had destroyed Gregory's place within it. Marcus was right about me having talent I hadn't known existed. Within the first year of working for him, I discovered I could look at a property or neighborhood and see not just what was there, but what could be there in 5 years. I understood population shifts, economic indicators, the subtle signs that marked an area on the verge of transformation. It wasn't magic or luck. It was pattern recognition combined with relentless research. The same skills that had made me a straight-A student back when achievements still mattered to me. My first independent deal came when I was 27. I'd been driving through a neighborhood east of downtown, an area most investors dismissed as too risky, when I noticed something. New restaurants were opening quietly, young professionals were moving into renovated lofts, a coffee shop had replaced a check-cashing store. The signs were there for anyone paying attention. On the corner sat a small boutique hotel, that had been elegant once but had fallen into disrepair. Its Art Deco facade covered in grime, half its windows boarded up. The owner was elderly and exhausted, ready to sell to anyone who'd take it off his hands. I ran the numbers obsessively, spent weeks researching comparable properties and renovation costs, created projections that Marcus reviewed line by line. When I finally presented the opportunity to him, laying out my entire strategy, he studied my work for what felt like hours, before looking up at me with something like pride. "This is solid work, Felicia. Really solid. How much capital do you need?" $250,000 to acquire it, and another $150,000 for renovations. I said, my voice steadier than my hands. "I'll pay you back with interest within 3 years. He smiled slightly. "I'll loan you the money at prime rate plus 1%. But Felicia understands something: this will consume your life for the next year at minimum. You'll be working 18-hour days, dealing with contractors who lie and inspectors who find problems you didn't budget for. Are you ready for that?" I thought about the 3 years I'd spent working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating ramen in a crowded apartment. "I've done harder things for less reward," I told him. The next 6 months proved him right about the difficulty, and me right about the opportunity. I learned more about construction design permits and human nature than any classroom could have taught me. I managed contractors who tried to overcharge me, handled building code violations the previous owner had concealed, redesigned interiors myself when the architect's vision exceeded my budget. I painted walls alongside the crew, learned basic plumbing because it was cheaper than calling someone for every small issue, negotiated with suppliers until they gave me prices they'd never offered before. When I finally reopened the property as the East Side Inn, a boutique bed and breakfast targeting young professionals and visiting families, it was beautiful in a way that honored the building's history while making it relevant to modern tastes. Within a year, we were profitable. Within 18 months, I'd repaid Marcus the full loan amount, plus interest, 6 months ahead of schedule. When I tried to split the profits with him according to our standard partnership structure, he refused. "You did this work, Felicia. The risk was mine, but the vision and execution were entirely yours. Keep the profit. Build something else with it. That's how wealth compounds. You reinvest success into larger successes." He handed me a check that represented more money than I'd seen in my life. "And Felicia, I'm proud of you. I want you to know that." Those words meant more than the money. The lesson that shaped me most, though, came during a dispute with a competing developer who'd tried to acquire a property I'd been negotiating for. When I lost the deal, I was furious, convinced he'd used underhanded tactics. I stormed into Marcus's office with a plan to retaliate, to spread information about the competitor's past legal troubles, to damage his reputation enough that future deals would avoid him. Marcus listened patiently to my entire vengeful strategy, then leaned back in his chair and said something I've never forgotten. "Felicia, there's a fundamental difference between being powerful and being ruthless. Powerful people don't need to destroy others to succeed. They succeed so thoroughly, so completely, that their competitors become irrelevant. Revenge makes you obsessed with your enemies, constantly looking backward at who wronged you instead of forward at what you're building. Dignity means staying focused on your own excellence, creating value instead of destroying others." I started to argue that the business world required toughness, that nice people finished last. He held up a hand to stop me. "I didn't say be nice. I said be dignified. There's a difference. Be tough in negotiations, protect your interests, refuse to be exploited. But don't become the kind of person who derives satisfaction from others' failures. Don't become like the people who hurt you." The last sentence landed with particular weight, and I realized he knew more about my family situation than I'd ever explicitly told him. Those words became my philosophy. I built my career by being better than my competitors, not by tearing them down. I created value, treated people fairly, kept my word even when it cost me. My reputation grew quietly but powerfully through word of mouth, through clients who told other clients, through contractors who preferred working with someone who paid on time and treated them with respect. By the time I turned 32, I owned a portfolio of 8 properties worth approximately $3 million total. I'd paid off every penny of my father's debt, erasing that weight from my life completely. I'd completed my MBA while working full-time, graduated with honors again, though this time for myself, rather than seeking anyone's approval. I'd established myself as someone to watch in commercial real estate, invited to speak on panels consulted by other developers, respected by people whose opinion actually mattered. I stayed deliberately under the radar publicly. No social media presence showcasing my success, no profiles in lifestyle magazines, no appearances at society events. I remembered too vividly what it felt like to be invisible, to be the person no one noticed or valued. I refused to build my self-worth by making others feel small. My reputation spread through competence and integrity, and that felt more solid than any publicity campaign. Then, one Tuesday afternoon in early spring, Marcus called me into his office with unusual formality. His expression was serious in a way I'd never seen, and something about his posture seemed diminished, as if he'd aged years in the weeks since I'd last really looked at him. "Sit down, Felicia," he said quietly. "I need to tell you something before it's too late. I'm dying, and there are things you need to know about your family and about me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible. Dying. Family. Secrets that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. I sat frozen in the chair across from Marcus's desk, trying to process what he'd just said. "Stage 4, pancreatic cancer," he continued, his voice steady despite the devastating words. "Diagnosed 3 weeks ago. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. I've started getting my affairs in order, which includes telling you the truth I should have shared years ago." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder I'd never seen before, thick with documents and photographs. "My real name is Gregory Hart. I'm your father's cousin, first cousins, actually. We grew up together closer than brothers for the first 20 years of our lives." I couldn't speak. Hart. He was family. All this time, the man who'd been more of a father to me than my actual father had been blood relation, and he'd never said a word. Marcus Gregory opened the folder and spread photographs across his desk. Black and white images from the 1960s showing 2 young men who could have been brothers, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the careless joy of people who believed family was forever. One of them was unmistakably a younger Marcus. The other looked shockingly like my father before bitterness had carved deep lines into his face. "We were inseparable until 1967, Marcus said quietly, touching one of the photographs with careful fingers. "That's when I met Catherine, the woman who became my wife. She was brilliant, beautiful, and black. Our family couldn't accept it. Your grandfather wrote me letters." He pulled out yellowed pages covered in angry handwriting, words I could barely stand to read. Slurs, threats, demands that Gregory end the relationship or be cut off completely. When I married her anyway, they erased me, forbade anyone from speaking my name, removed me from family photographs, told people I'd died. Your father was supposed to be my best man. Instead, he stood with the family and never spoke to me again. My hands trembled as I looked through the evidence of a history I'd never known existed. Why didn't you tell me when you first found me, when you offered me the job? Why hide this? Because I needed you to trust me based on who I was, not on family connection, he said. The Hart family name had brought you nothing but pain. I wanted to give you something different, mentorship earned through competence, not obligation, claimed through blood. He leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. I kept track of the family over the years, watched from a distance. When I learned what your father had done to you with that loan, how they'd all abandoned you to struggle alone, I saw the same cruelty that had driven me out repeating itself with a new generation. I couldn't save myself from their toxicity, but I could save you. So I did. I felt anger and gratitude warring inside me, unable to fully process the revelation. You've been watching me since I was a child. Not watching like that. Just aware. I knew you existed, knew your basic situation. When the loan default happened, And you started working 3 jobs. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it. That's when I decided to intervene. He met my eyes directly. I'm sorry I kept this from you. But I'm not sorry I helped you. You deserved someone who believed in you, Felicia. I'm just sorry I couldn't give you that sooner. We talked for hours that day, Marcus filling in decades of family history I'd never known. Then we stopped talking about the past and started planning for the future, my future since his was measured in months now. He died on a Tuesday morning in late summer, Catherine holding his hand in their home while I sat on his other side. He'd refused hospitalization, choosing to spend his final weeks in the place he'd built with the woman his family had rejected him for loving. At the end, he looked at me and said simply, "Make me proud, but more importantly, make yourself proud." His will was read 2 weeks later in his attorney's office. He left me his real estate consulting firm, 12 employees, modest but stable revenue, nothing flashy but solid. And he left me $500,000 in liquid assets, more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. But the inheritance came with a condition written directly into the trust documents in language clearly drafted by Marcus himself. These resources are given to Felicia Hart to build something dignified, not to pursue revenge against those who have wronged her. Should the trustee determine that the funds are being used primarily to harm others rather than create value, the remaining assets will be donated to charity organizations serving disadvantaged youth. Even from beyond death, Marcus was teaching me, guiding me, ensuring I didn't let pain corrupt me into becoming like the family that had hurt us both. I honored his wishes in ways that would have made him proud. I took that $500,000 and invested it carefully into properties other developers ignored, struggling buildings in neighborhoods on the edge of transformation places where I could create affordable housing units alongside market-rate developments. I renovated with respect for existing communities hired locally when possible, created spaces that served real needs rather than just maximizing profit. Over 5 years through calculated risks and relentless work, I turned that $500,000 into $8 million. My reputation grew as someone who did ethical development, who proved you could be profitable without being predatory. I named my company Grey Heart Properties, honoring both the name Marcus had chosen and the family heritage we shared. I carried his lessons with me every day. Power without dignity is tyranny. Success without generosity is emptiness, and revenge is a poison you drink yourself hoping someone else will die. I built my empire by being better than those who'd hurt me, not by becoming like them. Then, one afternoon when I was 36 years old, my attorney called with information that would test everything Marcus had taught me about dignity versus revenge. Lakeview Country Club. The most prestigious, exclusive club in the entire state, the social pinnacle my parents had worshipped from a distance, my entire childhood was being sold. The owner, a man named Victor Blackwell, was facing bankruptcy and federal fraud charges. The property would go to auction within 60 days. Victor Blackwell, the same man who had sabotaged my father's business 15 years ago, setting in motion the chain of events that had buried me in debt and taught me exactly who my family really was. The symbol of everything my parents had always wanted was suddenly within my reach, and it was being sold by the man who'd started my family's destruction. The moment I heard Victor Blackwell's name connected to Lakeview Country Club, memories flooded back that I'd tried to bury. Lakeview hadn't just been a country club to my family, it had been an obsession, a symbol of everything they believed they deserved but could never attain. My grandparents had applied for membership back in the 1970s when the club first opened, convinced their modest success in local business would be sufficient. They'd been rejected with a form letter citing insufficient social standing, a humiliation my grandfather never recovered from. He'd died still bitter about it, still convinced the world had denied him his rightful place. My parents had inherited that bitterness along with his modest estate. Throughout my childhood, we'd driven past Lakeview countless times, my father slowing the car to stare through the ornate iron gates at the manicured grounds beyond. "That's where the real players are," he'd say, his voice tight with longing and resentment. That's where deals get made, where the right connections open every door. If we could just get in there, everything would change for this family. My mother would nod in agreement, pointing out members she recognized from newspaper society pages, spinning fantasies about the dinner parties they'd host, the important people they'd befriend. They'd applied for membership at least 3 times that I knew of each rejection, deepening their conviction that the world was conspiring against them, that they were victims of a system designed to keep worthy people out. The irony was painful. They blamed external forces for their exclusion, while treating their own daughter with the exact same dismissive cruelty they claimed to suffer from. They'd absorbed the message that social status and external validation mattered more than character or genuine human connection, and that poison had infected everything in their lives, including how they'd raised their children. Young Felicia had sat in the back seat during those drives, listening to her parents' fantasies, absorbing their values before she knew enough to question them. For years, I'd believed what they believed, that belonging to the right club, knowing the right people, displaying the right markers of success, were what made a person valuable. It had taken Marcus's mentorship and my own hard-won experience to understand how hollow those values were, how little external validation mattered compared to genuine competence and integrity. Now at 36, I stood looking at information about that same club's impending sale, and the bitter poetry of the situation wasn't lost on me. Victor Blackwell owned it, the man who'd deliberately sabotaged my father's business, who'd set in motion the chain of events that had buried me in debt and revealed my family's true nature, had been profiting from the very symbol my parents had worshipped. Part of me wanted to see divine justice in his downfall, wanted to feel vengeful satisfaction. But Marcus's voice echoed in my mind, "Revenge is poison you drink yourself." I approached the acquisition as pure business strategy, not personal vendetta. I spent 2 weeks analyzing every aspect of the property: financial records, physical condition, membership demographics, competitive positioning. The club was undervalued because of Blackwell's legal troubles and the stigma surrounding his fraud charges. The facilities needed significant updating, but the bones were excellent, with prime real estate and infrastructure that could support expanded services. The existing membership was aging and declining, but the brand still carried weight. With proper management and strategic investment, it could become profitable within 3 years and dominant within 5. I assembled a group of investors, people I'd worked with successfully on previous projects who trusted my judgment. I prepared a comprehensive business plan that outlined renovation costs, operational improvements, membership growth strategies, and realistic financial projections. When the property went to auction, I submitted a competitive bid of $8.5 million, financed through a combination of my own capital investor partnerships and a commercial loan I knew I could service and repay within 7 years. 3 other bidders competed, but my due diligence and financial structure were superior. I won the acquisition. My vision for the club was deliberate and specific. I wasn't interested in creating another playground for old money to exclude new money, another institution where family name mattered more than individual character. I wanted to build something Marcus would have approved of, a space where respect and dignity were the actual membership requirements, where people earned their place through community contribution and personal integrity rather than inheritance or connections. I renovated extensively, upgrading the golf course, modernizing the dining facilities, adding a state-of-the-art fitness center and spa. I implemented new member services focused on networking with purpose, not just socializing, but creating genuine value through connections. Most importantly, I quietly reformed the membership criteria. Applications would be evaluated on character references, community involvement, and professional accomplishment, rather than purely wealth or family lineage. I wanted members who contributed something meaningful to society, who treated service staff with respect, who understood that privilege came with responsibility. I renamed it the Hart Estate, a decision that felt like reclaiming stolen territory. To the public, it was just a name, elegant, memorable, suggesting heritage and quality. To me, it honored Marcus's memory and his real name, Gregory Hart, while simultaneously placing my own family name on the very institution that had rejected them. They'd never know that the club bearing their name was owned by the daughter they'd discarded. Within 18 months, the Hart estate became the most prestigious address in the region's social landscape. The waiting list grew to over 300 applicants. Articles appeared in lifestyle magazines praising the club's transformation and refined atmosphere. My ownership remained carefully private managed through corporate structures that kept my name out of public records. I preferred it that way. Power exercised quietly is power that can't be easily challenged. Then, 6 months into our successful operation, David walked into my office holding a folder with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Felicia, we have new membership applications that require your attention. 2 of them in particular." He placed the folder on my desk, open to the first page. There, in neat, typewritten letters, were the names Richard Hart and Patricia Hart. My parents claiming they deserved membership based on long-standing community ties and their ability to pay the $50,000 annual dues, completely unaware that their forgotten daughter now controlled the gates they'd spent decades trying to enter. I told David I'd review the applications and give him a decision within the week, then sat alone in my office staring at my parents' paperwork for what felt like hours. The application was thorough and professional, clearly prepared with care. Letters of recommendation from 3 local business owners who probably owed my father favors. Financial statements showing they could comfortably afford the $50,000 annual dues, though I suspected they'd stretched their resources dangerously thin to reach that threshold. A professionally taken photograph of them looking prosperous and distinguished, dressed in country club appropriate attire they'd probably purchased specifically for this application. But it was the personal essay that made my stomach turn. My mother's handwriting filled the space where applicants were asked to explain why they sought membership at the Hart estate. "Our family has worked for decades to achieve the standing worthy of this prestigious institution," she'd written in her careful script. "We believe strongly in community service, family values, and the cultivation of meaningful relationships with like-minded individuals. Membership would represent the culmination of our life's aspirations and a validation of the principles we've always held dear." Every word was calculated to present them as worthy as people who understood what the club represented. Every word revealed they'd learned absolutely nothing. They were still measuring worth by external validation, still believing that belonging to the right club proved something fundamental about their value as human beings. My first instinct was immediate rejection. I could write a formal letter citing any number of legitimate reasons. Membership capacity reached concerns about financial sustainability, insufficient community involvement. It would be professionally worded and completely justified. They'd be disappointed but would never know their own daughter had denied them. That felt safe, clean, like closing a door that should have been closed years ago. But then Marcus's words echoed in my mind, dignity over revenge. Simply rejecting them was too small, too easy. It gave me a moment of satisfaction but changed nothing, taught nothing. They'd just add it to their long list of grievances about how the world had wronged them, never understanding the deeper lesson about character and consequence. I considered the opposite approach, approving their membership immediately and revealing my ownership later, watching their faces when they realized their forgotten daughter controlled the institution they'd worshipped. That had a certain dramatic appeal, but the more I thought about it, the more manipulative it felt. It was a game of power play beneath the person Marcus had taught me to become. For 3 days I wrestled with the decision. I called my therapist, Dr. Morrison, and spent an hour on her couch talking through the tangle of emotions. "What do you actually want from this situation?" she asked. "Not what you think you should want, but what would give you genuine peace." I didn't have an answer. I walked for hours through the city, past properties I owned, through neighborhoods I'd helped revitalize, trying to find clarity and movement. I even drove to the cemetery where Marcus was buried and stood at his grave in the cold, asking the marble headstone what he would advise. The stone predictably offered no answers. Finally, on the 4th day, sitting at my desk at 2 a.m. with the application spread before me, I understood what I needed. Not revenge, not even confrontation exactly, but clarity. I wanted my parents to truly see me not as the invisible daughter they'd discarded, not as the desperate co-signer they'd exploited, but as the woman I'd become, despite everything they'd done to diminish me. I wanted them to sit in a room and hear truths about family respect and dignity from someone they didn't recognize. And then I wanted to watch their faces when they realized that person was me. The solution came to me fully formed. I would implement a new club policy requiring all prospective members to attend a mandatory orientation session about hard estate values before their applications could be finalized. The orientation would cover respect, family dignity, community contribution, all the principles my parents had failed to embody. And I would personally lead these sessions. My parents would sit there, probably impatient and condescending, listening to someone they assumed was just staff, never imagining that the woman teaching them about character was their own daughter. It was a test in multiple ways. Would they recognize me after 7 years? Would anything I said about genuine family values penetrate their self-absorption? Would they treat me with the dismissive rudeness they showed anyone they considered beneath them, or had they learned any capacity for basic courtesy? Their behavior during that orientation would tell me everything I needed to know about whether they'd changed at all. I called David into my office the next morning. "Implement a new policy effective immediately," I told him. "All prospective members must attend a mandatory orientation about club values before final approval. I'll conduct the sessions personally. Schedule them quarterly, maximum 20 applicants per session." He nodded, taking notes. "And David, make sure Richard and Patricia Hart are registered for the January session. Confirm their attendance, but don't provide any details about who conducts the orientation. Just tell them it's a standard requirement for all applicants." "Understood," he said, then hesitated. "Felicia, are you sure about this approach? It's more complicated than a simple yes or no." "I'm sure," I said, though my hands were shaking slightly as I signed the policy document. Sometimes the right path isn't the simple one. David scheduled the orientation for January 15th, confirming my parents' attendance via email. I had 2 months to prepare to decide exactly what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. I wrote and rewrote my presentation, practiced my delivery until it was perfect, planned every detail of how that session would unfold. But 3 weeks before the scheduled orientation, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a familiar voice I hadn't heard in over 7 years said shakily, "Felicia, it's Emily. Please don't hang up. I need to see you urgently. It's about Mom and Dad and money, and I think I've made a terrible mistake." Emily's voice on the phone had that specific tremor I recognized from childhood, the one she used when she wanted something but was pretending to be vulnerable. "Please don't hang up. I need to see you urgently. It's about Mom and Dad and money, and I think I've made a terrible mistake." The words tumbled out quickly, rehearsed but trying to sound spontaneous. I stood at my office window watching the city lights flicker in the December darkness and felt that familiar tightness in my chest. 7 years of silence, and now this. I wanted to hang up immediately to protect the peace I'd built so carefully. Instead, I heard myself say, "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, my office." I gave her the address and ended the call before she could thank me or manipulate me further. The next afternoon, I watched from my window as Emily arrived in the circular driveway below, stepping out of a Mercedes that was probably leased beyond her means. Even from 20 floors up, I could read her body language, the way she paused to check her reflection in the building's glass doors, the confident stride that faltered slightly when she entered the marble lobby. My assistant David called up from reception. "Your 2 o'clock is here, Ms. Hart. Should I send her up?" I took a slow breath and said yes. Emily emerged from the elevator wearing a cream-colored designer suit I recognized from a fashion magazine spread, carrying a handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But there was something off about her appearance. The suit was last season's collection, the handbag showed wear at the corners, and her makeup was applied more heavily than usual, covering something. Dark circles, probably. Stress. When she saw me standing in the hallway outside my office suite, her expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and forced casualness in rapid succession. "Felicia," she said, her voice bright and artificial. "Wow, this is quite an office." She looked around at the exposed brick walls, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. "I'm impressed. You've done okay for yourself." The condescension was automatic, reflexive, ingrained so deeply, she probably didn't even notice she was doing it. Okay. As if my success was surprising, but still somehow less than adequate. I gestured toward my private office without responding to the backhanded compliment. Inside, I offered her coffee, which she accepted. David brought it in on a tray with cream and sugar, professional and courteous. Emily watched him leave, and then turned to me with that same forced brightness. "So you have an assistant now. That's nice." She settled into the leather chair across from my desk, crossing her legs, carefully smoothing her skirt. I sat down and waited, saying nothing. I'd learned years ago that silence was a powerful tool with people like Emily. They couldn't tolerate. It couldn't resist filling it with whatever they'd come to say. She lasted maybe 30 seconds before starting. "I know we haven't talked in a long time. I know things ended badly between us. But we're still family, Felicia, and families help each other when times get hard." The preamble was brief, and then she got to the real reason she'd tracked me down. Her husband Jason's consulting business was failing, had been failing for over a year. They'd taken out a second mortgage on their house to keep it afloat, had maxed out credit cards, had borrowed from friends. Now they were 3 months behind on the mortgage and facing foreclosure. The bank had sent final notices. They needed $200,000 immediately, or they'd lose everything. "I thought since you're doing well now, maybe you could help family," Emily said, the emphasis on family, heavy with expectation. "It's not like we're asking for charity. We'd pay you back eventually once Jason's business turns around." She didn't ask how I was doing, didn't inquire about my life or my well-being. This was purely transactional, a sister appearing after 7 years because she needed access to resources. Then she mentioned our parents. Dad's retirement investments had performed poorly, and they'd made some bad decisions trying to recover their losses. They were still living in the same house, still driving luxury cars, still throwing dinner parties they couldn't afford, all to maintain the appearance of success. They were drowning in debt, but too proud to scale back, too attached to the social standing they'd built their entire identity around. Emily suggested I could help everyone by providing financial support, as if my bank account was a family resource they'd simply forgotten to access until now. I let her talk for 30 minutes, watching her employ every manipulation tactic I remembered from our childhood. First came guilt. "We're family, Felicia. Blood is supposed to mean something." Then flattery. "You were always the smart one, the responsible one. You know how to handle money better than any of us." Then victimhood. "We didn't have your advantages. You always had that ability to figure things out on your own. Some of us needed more support." And finally, when nothing else seemed to be working, subtle threats. "It would be unfortunate if people knew you refused to help your struggling family. I mean, you have a reputation now, a business. These things matter in your world, don't they?" I watched her performance with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing a play I'd seen too many times to find engaging anymore. Every word confirmed what I'd already known. They hadn't changed at all. Emily still saw me as a resource to exploit, still believed she was entitled to my help, simply because we shared DNA. She genuinely seemed to think that showing up after 7 years with demands and veiled threats was acceptable behavior, that I would simply write a check because she'd asked. When she finally finished, I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city I'd conquered while my family had been busy pretending I didn't exist. "I'll think about it and let you know my decision within a week," I said calmly, my voice giving away nothing. Emily's face brightened with relief. She'd interpreted my non-refusal as agreement, already mentally spending money I hadn't promised. She stood, gathered her expensive handbag, and thanked me effusively. "I knew you'd understand. I knew you'd help. That's who you are, Felicia. You take care of people." She left my office with a spring in her step, clearly believing she'd accomplished her mission. I stood at the window long after she'd gone, watching her Mercedes pull away from the building. My hands were shaking slightly, not from anger exactly, but from the clarity that had settled over me. My family had rediscovered my existence and saw me only as a resource to exploit. They still didn't know about the club, about my true wealth, about the fact that I held their social aspirations literally in my hands. They'd come to me with demands and manipulation, never once considering that I might have my own perspective on our family history, my own feelings about years of neglect and exploitation. That evening, after everyone else had left the office, I sat at my desk and sent David a message. "Accelerate the orientation schedule. I want the Hart family session moved to Christmas week. It's time to handle this situation properly." His response came back within minutes. "Understood. I'll make the arrangements." I shut down my computer and locked my office, walking through the empty suite toward the elevator. The city spread below me, through the window's lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. My family thought they'd found a solution to their problems. They had no idea they'd just accelerated their reckoning. The next morning, I sat at my desk drafting a response to Emily's request, choosing each word with surgical precision. "Dear Emily, after careful consideration, I must decline your request for financial assistance. Personal boundaries and the importance of financial independence are principles I hold deeply. I trust you and Jason will find alternative solutions to your challenges. Sincerely, Felicia." The language was professional, formal, deliberately cold. I wasn't trying to be cruel, but I also wasn't going to pretend we had the kind of relationship where her request was reasonable. I printed the letter on my company letterhead, signed it, and had David mail it from our office. The formality of it would sting more than a simple text refusal. Emily's response came within 48 hours, a series of increasingly angry text messages that revealed exactly who she was beneath the designer clothes and forced pleasantness. The first accused me of being selfish and cold-hearted. The second reminded me of everything our family did for me, which was such a brazen rewriting of history I almost laughed. The third called me bitter and vindictive, suggested I was punishing her for childhood dynamics that weren't her fault. The fourth and final message was the most telling. "You're going to regret this, Felicia. When you need family someday, don't come crying to us." Then silence. She'd said everything she needed to say, revealed everything I needed to know. They still saw themselves as the injured parties, still believed they held some moral high ground. With Emily handled, I turned my full attention to the orientation session. David had confirmed my parents' attendance for December 23rd at 2 o'clock, just 2 days before Christmas. The timing was deliberate on my part. They'd be stressed about their holiday preparations, financially stretched from financing their performative Christmas celebration, and psychologically primed to view the club orientation as the gateway to the social validation they'd craved for decades. They'd be vulnerable without realizing it, off balance, in exactly the way I needed them to be. I began preparing my presentation with the kind of meticulous care I usually reserved for multi-million-dollar development projects. The talk would be about what true family means, about respect and dignity, about how status without character is worthless, about the difference between belonging and merely being included. Every word would be aimed directly at them, though they wouldn't realize it initially. They'd sit there thinking they were enduring a routine membership orientation, never suspecting that the woman speaking was their forgotten daughter, never imagining that every carefully chosen phrase was a mirror being held up to their failures. I practiced in front of the full-length mirror in my office bathroom, watching my facial expressions, controlling my tone, ensuring that no tremor of emotion would betray me before I was ready. I needed to be calm, authoritative, completely professional. If I showed anger or pain, they'd dismiss everything I said as the bitterness of a resentful daughter. But if I remained composed, dignified, powerful, they'd have to confront the reality of who I'd become and what they'd lost. I rehearsed until I could deliver every sentence with steady conviction, until the words felt like armor rather than weapons. Meanwhile, I'd hired a private investigator to monitor my family's activities. I told myself it was just practical due diligence. But truthfully, I needed to know what they were planning, how they were living, whether they'd changed at all in the years since I'd left. The investigators' reports arrived weekly, filled with details that would have been almost comedic if they weren't so pathetic. My parents were planning an elaborate Christmas Eve dinner, a lavish affair they absolutely could not afford. They'd hired caterers, ordered expensive wines, sent printed invitations on heavy cardstock to what the investigator estimated was 40 guests. Local politicians, business owners, country club members from other establishments, social climbers hoping to network their way into better circles. The investigator discovered they'd taken out additional credit card advances to finance this Christmas performance, borrowing money at predatory interest rates to maintain an illusion of prosperity. The menu alone cost more than some families spent on rent. It was desperate and sad, this need to prove something to people who probably didn't care about them beyond surface-level social interactions. Everything was about appearance, about status, about being seen as successful. Nothing was about genuine connection or authentic relationship. They were drowning in debt while throwing a party to convince everyone they were thriving. The guest list the investigator obtained didn't include my name. Of course it didn't. I wasn't just uninvited, I was erased from the family narrative entirely. Extended family members, neighbors, business associates, all would gather in my childhood home, never knowing that Richard and Patricia Hart had an older daughter. Emily would be there with Jason, playing the role of the perfect only child. They'd rewritten their family history to exclude the inconvenient truth of my existence, which suited me perfectly. They wanted to pretend I didn't exist. I'd make that impossible. On December 20th, 3 days before the orientation, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would attend their Christmas Eve dinner uninvited. Not to crash it or cause a scene, not to confront them in front of their guests, but to arrive quietly, ring the doorbell like a normal person, and test whether they'd acknowledge my existence even privately at their door. I wanted to look into my father's eyes one more time before revealing my position of power. I wanted to give them one final chance to show basic human decency, to prove that somewhere beneath the pretension and cruelty there remained something redeemable. If they welcomed me even reluctantly, I'd reconsider my entire approach. But if they rejected me at their door, if they turned away their own daughter on Christmas Eve while entertaining strangers inside, it would make what came next feel justified rather than cruel. I was creating a perfect record of their character, documenting their choices, giving them every opportunity to do the right thing. When the reckoning came, when they finally understood who I'd become and what I controlled, they wouldn't be able to claim they'd been treated unfairly or judged without evidence. Every decision I made about their future would be grounded in their own demonstrated behavior. I bought a simple gift, wrapped it in silver paper, and wrote a card that said only, "Merry Christmas, Mom and Dad. Love, Felicia." I rehearsed the doorbell moment in my mind, imagined the expressions on their faces, prepared myself for rejection, while holding on to the smallest sliver of hope that they might surprise me. Hope was dangerous, I knew. Hope could make you vulnerable. But I needed to know definitively who they were before I revealed who I'd become. The days counted down like a timer on a bomb nobody else knew was ticking. December 21st. December 22nd. My presentation was perfected. My emotions controlled, my strategy clear. And then December 23rd arrived, cold and bright, the kind of winter morning that makes everything look clean and new, even when nothing has changed. That afternoon, my parents arrived at the Hart estate for their orientation session, pulling up in my father's aging luxury sedan that he'd probably detailed specifically for this occasion. Through my office window, I watched them emerge, dressed in their finest clothes. My mother wearing a navy suit that looked expensive from a distance, my father in a blazer and tie. They stood for a moment in the circular driveway, looking up at the building they believed would finally validate their worth, completely unaware that the woman who would decide their fate was about to walk through the door. I checked my reflection one final time, smoothed my own suit jacket, and headed toward the conference room where everything would change. From my office, I watched the security monitors as my parents arrived at the Hart estate 20 minutes early, their anxiety manifesting as forced confidence. My father handed his keys to the valet with the kind of exaggerated casualness that said he wanted everyone to notice he was comfortable in expensive places. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace 3 times in the lobby, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. They approached the reception desk where Maria greeted them with her usual professional warmth, and I watched my father's face arrange itself into what he probably thought was an expression of dignified importance. They were here to be evaluated, but somehow they'd already positioned themselves as evaluators, judging the staff, the decor, the other applicants who were beginning to arrive. David escorted them to the Westbrook Conference Room, one of our most elegant spaces with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course, leather chairs surrounding a mahogany table that seated 20. Coffee service had been arranged on the sideboard along with an assortment of pastries from the bakery we contracted with exclusively. I watched my parents enter the room and immediately begin surveying it like potential buyers assessing property. My mother ran her finger along the edge of the table as if checking for dust. My father walked to the windows and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, clearly performing for the other applicants who were filtering in. Over the next 15 minutes, 12 prospective members arrived and took their seats. I studied each one on the monitors, but my attention kept returning to my parents. They'd chosen seats near the head of the table, positioning themselves as if they naturally belonged in places of prominence. My mother leaned toward my father several times, whispering comments about the other applicants. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could read her expression, that particular curl of her lip, that meant she was finding people wanting, cataloging their deficiencies, establishing her own superiority. My father nodded along, occasionally glancing at his phone, even though the orientation hadn't begun yet. I took one final look at my reflection in the elevator mirror as I descended to the conference level. Navy suit tailored perfectly, hair pulled back in a professional chignon, minimal makeup, just enough to look polished. I'd dressed to project authority without ostentation, competence without trying to impress. I wanted to look like exactly what I'd told them. I was the club's director of member relations, someone who worked here, someone they'd never look at twice. I took 3 slow breaths, centered myself the way Dr. Morrison had taught me, and walked toward the conference room with steady, measured steps. When I entered, the conversations quieted. Everyone turned to look at the woman who would be evaluating their worthiness. I set my materials on the table at the head of the room and made eye contact with each applicant, letting my gaze linger on my parents for just a beat longer than the others. My mother looked directly at me, her eyes scanning my face, my suit, my posture. My father glanced up from his phone, assessed me in that quick, dismissive way he had, and returned his attention to his screen. Neither showed even a flicker of recognition. 7 years had changed me, certainly. Professional presentation and context had changed how I appeared. But more than that, their own willful blindness made me invisible to them. They'd erased me so completely from their mental landscape that seeing me standing in front of them didn't trigger any memory of their daughter. The pain of that non-recognition hit harder than I'd expected. I'd prepared myself for this possibility, had told myself it would actually help my plan if they didn't know who I was. But standing there, watching my own parents look through me as if I were just another piece of hotel furniture, something fundamental cracked inside my chest. I channeled that pain into focus, let it sharpen my purpose rather than break my composure. I introduced myself with carefully chosen words. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Director of Member Relations here at the Hart Estate, and I'll be conducting your orientation today. This session is mandatory for all prospective members because we believe that understanding our club's values is essential before joining our community." I didn't give my last name. I kept my tone professional, warm enough to be approachable, but formal enough to maintain authority. My mother was already looking slightly bored, and my father had only half closed his phone. I began the presentation I'd rehearsed dozens of times, each word weighted with meaning my parents wouldn't catch, but I felt in every syllable. The Hart Estate was founded on principles that we believe distinguish us from other clubs. We value respect above all else. Not just respect for those who share your status or background, but respect for every person you encounter regardless of their position or role. We believe that how you treat someone who can do nothing for you reveals your true character. I watched my father shift in his seat, clearly finding this elementary and beneath him. I continued making deliberate eye contact around the room. We value dignity. Every member of our community, from our ownership to our service staff, deserves to be treated with dignity. We've terminated memberships over violations of this principle because we believe an institution is only as dignified as the behavior it tolerates. My mother whispered something to my father, and he smirked slightly. They thought this was performative rhetoric, empty words that upscale establishments used to justify their exclusivity. Then I moved to the section I'd written specifically for them. We value family loyalty and understand that family takes many forms, but we also believe that true family loyalty means supporting one another through challenges, recognizing each other's worth, and treating family members with the same respect we'd show to honored guests. A person's character is often revealed most clearly in how they treat their own family when no one else is watching. I paused, letting the words settle. Can anyone share what family loyalty means to them? Several hands went up around the table, but I called on my father, who'd raised his hand with that particular confidence that assumed he'd provide the definitive answer. Family loyalty means children respecting their parents' sacrifices and supporting the family's advancement. He said clearly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never questioned his own perspective. Parents work hard to build something for the next generation. Children owe it to them to honor that work and contribute to the family's continued success. My mother nodded approvingly beside him, adding, "Exactly. Family is about maintaining standards and supporting those standards together." Neither of them noticed how several other applicants shifted uncomfortably at this one-directional definition of loyalty. I smiled thinly, keeping my expression neutral, even as rage burned in my chest. "Interesting perspective," I said carefully. "I wonder if loyalty should flow in both directions if parents also owe their children support, recognition, and basic dignity." My father looked mildly puzzled, as if he'd never considered the question. My mother's expression didn't change at all. The implication sailed completely over both their heads. I completed the presentation, covering club rules, membership, expectations, financial obligations, and community standards. Throughout the 30 minutes, I watched my parents with clinical attention. My father checked his phone twice more, not even trying to hide his distraction. My mother examined her manicure, once clearly bored by talk of respect and dignity. Neither showed any indication that anything I'd said about family character or treating people with basic human decency had penetrated their self-absorption. They were here to gain admission to an exclusive club, to add another status marker to their collection. The actual values were irrelevant to them. At the end of the session, I collected applications personally, moving around the table to shake each applicant's hand and gather their materials. When I reached my parents, my father handed me his application without really looking at me, already standing to leave. "Thank you for your time," I said directly to him. "We'll be in touch with our decision soon. Very soon." My mother had already turned away, gathering her handbag. As they walked toward the exit, I heard my father say to my mother, in a voice he clearly didn't bother to lower, "I'm not sure I want to join a club where we have to listen to lectures from staff. When we're members, we should report her attitude to management." My mother laughed, that specific crystalline sound I remembered from childhood. "Oh, Richard, she's probably required to give that speech. Once we're in, we'll never have to deal with her again." I stood there, holding their applications, watching them leave without a backward glance, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. They'd failed every test I'd given them. Now it was time to show them exactly who that staff member really was. Christmas Eve arrived with that crystalline winter clarity that makes everything look sharp and unforgiving. I dressed carefully in a simple red dress, elegant but understated, the kind of thing a daughter might wear to her parents' holiday gathering. The silver-wrapped gift sat on my passenger seat as I drove through neighborhoods decorated with lights and inflatable snowmen, past families visible through windows toward the house where I'd spent my invisible childhood. Cars lined both sides of the street near my parents' home, expensive sedans and luxury SUVs belonging to the guests they'd invited to witness their carefully constructed success. Through the large front windows, I could see bodies moving champagne glasses catching the chandelier light, the warm glow of a party in full swing. I sat in my car for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching my father move through the crowd with that particular energy he reserved for social performances. He was gesturing broadly, telling some story that had a small cluster of guests laughing. My mother glided past in a gold dress touching shoulders, refilling glasses, playing the perfect hostess with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the role. This was what they lived for, this performance of prosperity and social standing. This was what they'd chosen over having an actual relationship with their own daughter. I picked up the gift, stepped out into the cold evening air, and walked up the driveway past the Mercedes and BMWs parked in careful rows. The front door wreath was fresh evergreen with gold ribbon, expensive and tasteful. I could hear music and conversation, the party sounds muffled but unmistakable. I rang the doorbell and waited, my breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The door opened and my mother stood there in her gold dress, her face cycling through emotions so quickly I could catalog each one. Surprise first, then recognition, then immediate panic. Not happiness to see her daughter, not even anger. Just panic that I might embarrass them in front of their carefully curated guest list. She didn't say hello. She didn't invite me in. She just stood there blocking the doorway, her hand gripping the edge of the door as if physically holding me back. Before I could speak, my father appeared behind her, his face flushed from champagne or anger or both. "What are you doing here?" His voice was loud enough that conversations inside faltered, heads turning toward the door. "We didn't invite you." He moved my mother aside and stepped into the doorframe himself, filling it with his body, making it clear I wasn't welcome to cross the threshold. Emily emerged from somewhere behind them, still beautiful in a green cocktail dress, her face a mixture of mortification and something that might have been guilt. She didn't say anything, just stood there watching, like this was a terrible accident she couldn't look away from. Guests had begun gathering in the hallway behind my family, curious about the disturbance, probably thinking I was some unwanted solicitor or confused neighbor. I kept my voice quiet and steady. "I'm your daughter. It's Christmas. I thought perhaps we could—" My father cut me off with the kind of dismissive certainty that left no room for argument. "You thought wrong. You made it clear years ago you didn't need this family. Don't come back now because you need something." The words were designed to wound, to paint me as the problem, to make my appearance seem like opportunism rather than a daughter's hope for reconciliation. My mother glanced nervously at the guests gathering behind them, her priority obvious. "Richard, handle this outside. Our guests shouldn't have to witness this." Not concern for me, not embarrassment about how they were treating their own daughter, just worry about what their friends might think. My father stepped onto the porch, and his hand closed around my arm, not violently, but with that firm dismissiveness you'd use to guide away someone who didn't belong. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice lower now, but no less cutting. "You never did." He released my arm and stepped back inside, preparing to close the door. I stood there on the porch, the gift still in my hands, accepting this final demonstration of who they were. This was it. This was the answer to every question I'd carried for 37 years. They would reject me even on Christmas Eve, even knowing guests were watching, even when the decent thing would have been to at least fake kindness for appearance's sake. They couldn't even manage that. Just as I turned to leave, headlights swept across the lawn. A sleek black car pulled smoothly to the curb, and David stepped out in a tailored suit, his timing absolutely perfect because I'd planned it that way. He walked up the driveway with measured urgency, his expression professionally concerned. "Ms. Hart, I apologize for interrupting, but the situation at the club requires your immediate attention. The board members are waiting for your decision on several urgent matters." I saw my father's face register confusion at the formal address, at David's deference, at the expensive car idling at the curb. I nodded to David, then turned back to face my parents one final time. My mother had stepped onto the porch beside my father, both of them watching this interaction with growing bewilderment. Behind them, guests crowded in the doorway, unabashedly curious now. I looked directly into my father's eyes and spoke clearly. Actually, I don't need anything from you. I never did. But you needed something from me, didn't you? Membership to a certain country club? The Heart Estate. I watched the confusion on his face deepen, watched him try to process how I could possibly know about their application. How do you know about that? He started to ask, his voice uncertain now. I smiled, and it felt like ice forming over something that had once been capable of warmth. Because I own it, Dad. The club you've been desperately trying to join for 6 months, I built it. I run it. And your application... I paused, letting the moment stretch. It's denied. The color drained from my father's face as if someone had opened a valve. My mother's hand flew to her throat, gripping those pearls she couldn't really afford. Emily made a small sound behind them, something between a gasp and a moan. The guests in the doorway went absolutely silent, watching this impossible reversal. My father's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was finally truly seeing his daughter for the first time, not as the invisible girl he could dismiss or the convenient tool he could exploit, but as someone who now held power over the exact thing he'd sacrificed everything to obtain. And he had just slammed the door in her face. I turned and walked toward David's car without looking back, leaving them standing on the porch in front of their guests, with the truth settling over them like snow that would never melt. David drove me away from my childhood home, through falling snow, the silence in the car profound and strangely peaceful. I didn't look back. I'd spent 37 years looking back, hoping they'd see me, and now I was finally done. Through the rear window, I could imagine the chaos I'd left behind, the party dissolving into whispered conversations and shocked speculation, my parents standing on that porch, trying to process what had just happened. My private investigator's report the next day confirmed exactly what I'd imagined. The Christmas dinner had collapsed into complete chaos within minutes of my departure. Guests who'd witnessed the doorway confrontation had immediately begun texting other friends, spreading the story through their social network in real time. Several people had pulled out phones to search for information about me, discovering news articles about my real estate developments, business profiles, photographs from charity galas where I'd donated anonymously. The whispers had grown louder as more information emerged. According to the investigator's source, my father had stood frozen in the doorway for nearly 5 minutes. His face drained of color, unable to respond to questions or move back inside. My mother had rushed past him, running down the driveway in her gold dress and heels, calling after David's car. "Wait. There's been a misunderstanding. Felicia, please wait." But we'd already turned the corner, her voice swallowed by the winter night. Emily had apparently collapsed into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands, the reality settling over her like concrete. She'd asked her billionaire sister for $200,000 while treating her with contempt and threats. She'd watched her parents reject that same sister on Christmas Eve without saying a word in her defense. The investigator reported that Emily had started crying and couldn't stop, though, whether from genuine remorse or fear of consequences, no one could say. One guest, a local businessman named Martin Chen, who I actually knew was a Heart Estate member, had apparently confirmed the impossible truth to the room. "That was Felicia Hart. She's the owner of the Heart Estate. She's the one you've been trying to impress for 6 months." The question had hung in the air like an accusation. Several guests had left shortly after, making excuses about early mornings uncomfortable bearing witness to such a spectacular family implosion. Christmas morning arrived with my phone exploding into consciousness at 6:30. 17 missed calls from my mother, each voicemail progressively more desperate. The first was still trying to maintain dignity. "Felicia, this is your mother. Please call me back. We need to discuss what happened last night." By the 10th, the veneer had cracked. "Felicia, please, you have to understand, we didn't know. How could we have known?" The 17th was nearly incoherent. "You can't do this to us. You can't just destroy us like this." Not once did she actually apologize for anything specific, not the decades of neglect, not the exploitation, not slamming a door in my face on Christmas Eve. just panic that I might actually follow through on denying their membership. Emily's texts started arriving around 8 long, rambling messages that mixed apology with justification in equal measure. Felicia, I'm so sorry about everything. We didn't know you'd become so successful. You never told us. How were we supposed to know if you'd just communicated better, things could have been different? I know I made mistakes, but I was young, and Mom and Dad influenced me. Can we please talk? I need you to understand my perspective. Each message revealed the same fundamental inability to accept responsibility. Even in apology, she was making it my fault for not informing them of my success, as if that would have changed how they treated me, as if basic human decency was only owed to people with money. My father's email arrived at 9:47 formal and calculated, trying to reframe the entire situation through corporate language. Dear Felicia, last evening's events clearly resulted from miscommunications on both sides. Family dynamics are complex, and perhaps we've all made assumptions that contributed to misunderstandings. I propose we schedule a family meeting after the holidays to discuss matters rationally and explore how we might move forward productively. Regards, Richard Hart. The tone was almost businesslike, as if we were negotiating a merger rather than addressing 37 years of emotional abuse. Not one word of genuine apology, just careful positioning and face-saving language. He'd signed it with his full name, as if I might not know who my own father was. I read each message, once felt nothing but a distant sort of satisfaction, and deleted them all. I didn't block their numbers because I wanted to see how desperate they'd become, wanted documentation of their character for my own records. But I had no intention of responding. I'd given them multiple chances over the years, had offered opportunities for basic decency just the night before, and they'd failed every single test. Their panic now wasn't about losing me as a daughter. It was about losing access to the social status they'd sacrificed everything to pursue. I spent Christmas Day alone at the Hart estate, walking through the empty halls decorated with elegant garlands and twinkling lights, finding strange peace in the solitude. My staff had the day off to be with their families. I sat in my office overlooking the golf course, blanketed in fresh snow, drinking coffee and watching cardinals land on the ice-covered branches outside my window. For the first time in years, maybe in my entire life, I felt completely free from the weight of their judgment and disappointment. That afternoon, I drafted a formal letter to my parents on club letterhead. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hart, your membership application to the Hart estate has been permanently denied. This decision is final and not subject to appeal or reconsideration. The Hart estate seeks members who demonstrate genuine character integrity and the ability to treat all people with dignity regardless of their position or perceived value. You failed to recognize your own daughter standing in front of you after 7 years. You valued a country club membership more than a relationship with me. You turned me away on Christmas Eve while entertaining strangers. These facts tell me everything I need to know about your values, and nothing I want represented at my club. I wish you well in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Felicia Hart, Owner and Director. I signed it, sealed it in an official envelope, and instructed David to send it certified delivery, requiring signature. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been petty and personal. This was simply closure, a door finally closing on a relationship that had been dead for years. I felt lighter after sealing that envelope, as if I'd set down luggage I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was even there. I was finally definitively free from needing their approval or hoping for their love. They'd had every chance to be decent human beings, and they'd chosen status over family every single time. But on December 27th, something unexpected arrived in my office mail. A handwritten envelope, Emily's familiar looping script on the front, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, tear-stained and wrinkled, with just one line in shaky handwriting. I have a 2-year-old daughter they've never met because I was afraid to tell them the truth. Please, Felicia. I need help, and you're the only one who might understand. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling the ground shift beneath my carefully constructed closure. I stared at Emily's tear-stained note for hours, those words about a 2-year-old daughter creating fissures in my carefully constructed closure. Part of me wanted to crumple the letter and throw it away to maintain the clean break I'd finally achieved. But another part, the part Marcus had cultivated in me, couldn't ignore a child caught in the crossfire of family dysfunction. I texted Emily a single line: "Riverside Cafe tomorrow at 10. Come alone and bring proof of everything you've claimed." The Riverside Cafe was 40 minutes from our parents' neighborhood, a quiet place near the waterfront where we wouldn't encounter anyone from their social circle. I arrived early, chose a corner table with clear sightlines to the door, and ordered coffee I didn't drink. Emily arrived exactly on time, looking nothing like the polished woman who'd sat in my office 3 weeks ago. Her hair was pulled back in a careless ponytail, her face bare of makeup, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, no designer labels visible. She looked exhausted, diminished, aged beyond her 33 years, in a way that shocked me despite my anger. She slid into the chair across from me and immediately placed her phone on the table, opening the photo gallery with shaking hands. The screen filled with images of a beautiful little girl with dark curly hair and bright hazel eyes, maybe 2 years old, laughing in a park, sleeping with a stuffed elephant covered in what looked like birthday cake. "This is Sophie," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She just turned 2 in October." I looked at the photographs and saw complete innocence, a child who had no idea her existence was at the center of a family crisis. Emily's story came out in a flood, as if she'd been holding it back for so long that speaking the truth physically hurt. 4 years ago, during a period when her marriage to Jason was deteriorating, she'd had an affair with someone she'd met at a business conference. It lasted 3 months before she ended, it racked with guilt. When she discovered she was pregnant, she'd convinced herself the baby was Jason's, had desperately wanted it to be his. Jason had seemed excited about becoming a father, and for a while their marriage had actually improved. Sophie was born, and for 2 years they'd functioned as a family. But 2 months ago, during a vicious argument about money and Emily's spending habits, Jason had screamed that Sophie didn't even look like him, that he'd always suspected the truth. He'd demanded a paternity test, threatening to leave if Emily refused. The results had confirmed what he'd suspected. Sophie wasn't biologically his. The revelation had transformed Jason into someone Emily claimed she didn't recognize. He'd hired an aggressive attorney and was now demanding $500,000 in exchange for a quiet divorce, where he'd relinquish all parental rights without a custody battle or public exposure. It was pure extortion, but Emily was trapped. She couldn't afford competent legal representation, and she absolutely could not tell our parents the truth without destroying the carefully maintained image of the perfect daughter they'd built their identity around. "I thought about telling them," Emily said, tears streaming down her face now. "But you know what they're like. You know what they'd say. They'd tell me I'd disgraced the family. They'd probably disown me just like they disowned you, except I don't have your strength or your success. I'd have nothing." She wiped her face with a napkin, mascara smearing despite her lack of makeup. "When you refused to lend me money, I didn't know what to do. I was desperate and stupid and scared." Then she told me about the betrayal I hadn't even known had occurred. 2 weeks after I'd declined her loan request, a man claiming to be a journalist had contacted her saying he was investigating potential ethical violations at my company. He'd offered $50,000 for an exclusive interview about my past, about our family dynamics, about anything that might constitute a scandal. In her desperation to save Sophie, Emily had met with him, had provided information about the debt our parents had buried me under, about the family estrangement, about my years of struggling. She'd twisted details and implied things that weren't true, painting me as ruthless and vindictive, someone who'd abandoned her family without cause. "The article ran 3 days ago in the Metro Business Journal," she said, sliding a printed copy across the table. I scanned it quickly, feeling rage build as I read distorted versions of my life presented as exposé. The headline read, "Local Developer's Success Built on Family Betrayal." The piece portrayed me as someone who'd exploited family connections, then cut them off when I no longer needed them. It quoted Emily extensively, her words carefully edited to maximum damage. They told me they'd pay me $50,000, Emily sobbed. I was going to lose my daughter. I wasn't thinking about what it would do to you. I just needed the money to negotiate with Jason. I sat in silence processing this betrayal that somehow felt both shocking and inevitable. Emily had sold me out for money she'd never received because the journalist had disappeared after getting his story, probably never intending to pay her at all. She'd damaged my reputation, my business, my carefully built life for nothing. My instinct was to stand up and walk away to let her drown in consequences she'd created. But I kept looking at Sophie's photographs on her phone, at that innocent face that deserved better than to become another casualty of our family's fundamental dysfunction. Why should I help you after what you've done? I asked, my voice flat and cold. You tried to destroy me to save yourself. You chose the same path Mom and Dad always chose, valuing yourself over everyone else. Emily's response came out raw and broken. Because despite everything, you're the only person in this family who actually understands what it's like to be used and discarded. You know what Mom and Dad are really like. You saw through their manipulation and escaped. I didn't. I stayed, and I let them mold me into someone who makes terrible choices out of fear. Now my daughter is paying the price for my weakness. She looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. I'm not asking for myself, Felicia. I'm asking for Sophie. She deserves better than to become another generation damaged by this family's toxicity. She deserves a chance I never gave you. I stood gathering my coat, preparing to leave without committing to anything. But at the table, I paused and looked down at my sister's devastated face. I'll need to verify your story completely. If you're telling the truth about Jason's extortion and the journalist, I'll help. But Emily, this is the only time. There won't be a second chance, no more rescues, no more bailouts. I started walking toward the door, then turned back one more time. And you're going to publicly retract everything you told that journalist, even if it means admitting you lied. You're going to tell the truth about our family and about me. That's the price. Emily nodded, sobbing too hard to speak, and I walked out into the winter morning, knowing I'd just complicated everything I'd worked so hard to resolve. I contacted my private investigator immediately after leaving the cafe, instructing him to verify every detail of Emily's story and trace the origins of that damaging article. I needed to know if my sister was telling the truth or simply deploying a more sophisticated manipulation. Within 48 hours, his report landed on my desk, and what I read transformed my understanding of the entire situation. The journalist who'd interviewed Emily was indeed a freelance writer named Thomas Garrett, who specialized in corporate espionage disguised as investigative journalism. The $50,000 Emily had been promised was never intended to materialize. Garrett had been paid $15,000 by someone else to extract damaging information from my sister and publish it under the guise of legitimate reporting. The money trail led through 2 shell corporations before arriving at a name that made my blood run cold: Victor Blackwell. The same man who'd sabotaged my father's business 20 years ago. The same man whose bankruptcy and disgrace had created the opportunity for me to purchase the country club property. Blackwell had been systematically orchestrating a revenge campaign against me, seeking to damage my reputation and business prospects the way I'd inadvertently damaged his by succeeding where he'd failed. He'd researched my background, thoroughly identified Emily as a vulnerable target, and deployed Garrett to exploit her desperation. My sister had been a pawn in someone else's vendetta, though that didn't absolve her of choosing to betray me when presented with the opportunity. But the investigator's report revealed something even more disturbing. Emily's husband, Jason, wasn't just an opportunistic extortionist acting alone. 6 months ago, he'd attended a business development conference in Chicago where he'd met Victor Blackwell at a networking reception. Phone records showed multiple calls between them in the months since. The investigator had obtained emails through methods I decided not to ask about, and they painted a clear picture. Jason's sudden demand for paternity testing, his $500,000 extortion scheme, his timing and specific tactics had all been suggested by Blackwell. Jason didn't actually want Emily's money. He wanted to pressure her into destroying me publicly in exchange for his silence about Sophie's paternity. The entire custody threat was leverage designed to turn my sister into a weapon against me. Emily genuinely hadn't understood she was being manipulated until after the article ran and Garrett disappeared without paying her. When I called her to my office and presented the investigation results, spreading documents across my desk that connected Jason to Blackwell, to the false journalist, she broke down so completely, I thought she might physically collapse. "I'm so stupid," she kept repeating, her voice raw with self-loathing. "I thought I was saving my daughter and I was just helping someone destroy you. I played right into exactly what they wanted." She looked at the evidence with shaking hands, seeing the conspiracy laid out in phone records and email transcripts. Jason never loved Sophie. He was just waiting for the right moment to use her against me, against us, against you. I spent 3 days considering my options, walking through scenarios with David, and my attorney weighing consequences and outcomes. I could expose the entire conspiracy publicly, clear my name completely, and destroy everyone involved, including Emily, whose betrayal would be revealed as both willing and manipulated. It would be justified, clean, and devastating. Or I could handle everything quietly through legal channels, protecting my sister while still holding her accountable in ways that mattered. The choice revealed what kind of person I wanted to be, whether Marcus's lessons about dignity had actually taken root, or whether I was still operating from a place of wounded pride. I chose a middle path that felt true to both justice and mercy. I would hold a press conference refuting the article with documented facts, forcing Emily to appear beside me and publicly apologize for being deceived and for betraying her sister's trust. She would face social consequences and public embarrassment, but avoid legal prosecution. Then I would go after Blackwell with everything I had, filing lawsuits for orchestrated harassment, defamation, and conspiracy. My attorneys assured me we had an airtight case that would likely bankrupt him permanently. As for Emily's custody situation, I wouldn't simply give her money to pay off Jason's extortion. Instead, I hired Catherine Morse, the most aggressive and effective family law attorney in the state, with instructions to expose Jason's extortion attempt, document his conspiracy with Blackwell, and ensure Sophie remained with her mother, while Jason faced criminal charges for his actions. I scheduled the press conference for January 2nd, giving Emily 4 days to prepare herself for public confession and giving my team time to compile irrefutable evidence. I drafted remarks that would clear my reputation without destroying Emily completely, walking a careful line between truth and protection. Catherine Morse filed emergency motions in family court, and Jason suddenly found himself facing legal consequences he hadn't anticipated. Everything was coming together with the precision I'd built my business empire on. But when I arrived home that evening to continue preparing, I found my mother, Patricia, sitting on the floor outside my apartment door, her back against the wall, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. She held a small leather journal clutched against her chest, and when she saw me approaching, she stood with visible effort. "Before you destroy this family completely," she said, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying, "you need to read this. It's my diary from the last 30 years. Everything you think you know about us is wrong." She held the journal out with trembling hands, and I saw tears tracking down her carefully made-up face. "Please, Felicia, just read it before the press conference, then decide what you want to do." I took the journal from my mother's trembling hands, skeptical and exhausted, and not ready for whatever manipulation this might be. Patricia looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said quietly, "I kept this hidden in a safe deposit box your father didn't know about. I've been writing in it since before you were born. Read it, all of it. Then decide whether you still hate me." She turned and walked toward the elevator without waiting for a response. Her shoulders hunched as if carrying physical weight. I stood in my doorway holding the worn leather-bound book, its pages thick with decades of ink, and something in my chest tightened with unwanted hope. Inside my apartment, I made tea I wouldn't drink and sat on my couch with the journal in my lap, almost afraid to open it. The first entry was dated March 1987, 2 months before I was born. My mother's handwriting was younger, then rounder, filled with optimistic loops. I felt her kick today. Richard put his hand on my stomach and smiled. He said we're going to have the most beautiful family. I can't wait to meet our daughter. I already love her so much. I read about her excitement, her dreams of being a good mother, her plans for the nursery. These pages showed a woman I'd never known someone genuinely joyful about becoming a parent. Then the tone shifted. Entries from after my birth documented Richard's behavior emerging like a slow poison. Richard says I hold Felicia too much, that I'm going to spoil her. He took her from my arms today and put her in the crib even though she was crying. He said mothers need to be strong, not soft. I don't understand what he means. Another entry a few months later. Richard criticizes everything I do. How I feed her, how I dress her, how I respond when she cries. He says if I don't toughen up, our daughter will become weak and useless. I'm starting to be afraid when he comes home. The pattern escalated over pages, Richard's controlling behavior, intensifying his demands, becoming more specific and cruel. An entry from my 3rd birthday made my hands shake. I planned a small party for Felicia. Just family. A cake, some presents. Richard came home and saw the decorations. He tore them down and told me I was making her think she was special when she's just ordinary. He threw the cake I'd made in the trash. I tried to argue and he grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. He said if I ever undermined his parenting decisions again, he'd leave and take Felicia where I'd never find her. I believe him. I can't lose my daughter, so I did nothing. I let her 3rd birthday pass like any other day. Page after page revealed the horror of my mother's trapped existence. Richard had demanded she favor Emily deliberately to balance my intelligence, which he perceived as threatening to his authority. One entry from when I was 7 read, Richard told me today that Felicia is too smart for her own good. He said girls who think they're clever become impossible to control. He's insisted I stop praising her, stop attending her school events, create emotional distance so she doesn't develop an inflated sense of importance. He said, if Felicia thinks she's special, she'll become uncontrollable like my sister was. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified of him. The entry from my 10th birthday destroyed something inside me. I baked a cake in secret while Richard was at work. I decorated it with purple frosting because purple is Felicia's favorite color. I was going to surprise her after dinner. Richard came home early and found it in the kitchen. He picked it up and threw it directly into the trash, then grabbed my face and said, "Don't make her think she matters more than she does. She's just one child in this family, and she needs to learn her place." I locked myself in the bathroom and cried for an hour. My daughter thinks I forgot her birthday. I wish I could tell her the truth, but Richard says if I undermine him, he'll take both girls and I'll never see them again. I believe him. I always believe him because I know what he's capable of. I read about my Stanford acceptance through tears I couldn't stop. My mother had been thrilled, had wanted to celebrate, had secretly sent a congratulations card to my dorm address. Richard had found the credit card charge, tracked down what she'd sent driven to Stanford himself, and somehow intercepted it. He'd returned home and berated Patricia for hours about encouraging rebellion and making Felicia think she's better than her family. The entry from that day. He said if I ever contact her directly again, he'll make sure she knows I never wanted her, that I only had her because birth control failed. He'll poison her against me completely. So I stay silent and let her think I don't care. It's killing me. My college graduation, my wedding to Marcus, every milestone I'd experienced believing my mother simply didn't care enough to show up was recontextualized in these pages. She'd wanted to attend my graduation desperately, but Richard had forbidden it, creating the excuse about Emily being sick. She'd wanted to meet Marcus, but Richard had threatened to show up and cause a scene that would humiliate me. Every absence had been forced, every silence had been coerced, every moment of apparent indifference had been survival strategy in an abusive marriage I'd never suspected existed. The entries from recent years showed Patricia's evolution. She'd been secretly saving money in accounts Richard didn't know about, consulting with a divorce attorney, gathering evidence of his abuse, preparing to leave him safely. She'd planned to reach out to me after the divorce was final to finally tell the truth and beg for forgiveness, knowing I might not grant it, but hoping I'd at least understand. She'd been building an escape for 3 years, moving with painful slowness to avoid detection. The final entry was dated December 20th, 3 days before the orientation at the Hart estate. Richard found my escape fund somehow. He confronted me this morning, threatening to hurt himself and blame me if I leave. He said he'll tell everyone I abandoned him, that I'm an unfit mother, that I destroyed our family. He has friends in the police department who will believe him. Tomorrow, we have an orientation at a country club he's desperate to join. I discovered today that Felicia owns it. He doesn't know. Maybe this is my chance to see my daughter one more time, even if she doesn't recognize me. Maybe this is my chance to find the courage to finally leave him, knowing she survived him and became strong. I'm so tired of being afraid. I closed the journal and sat in silence as my entire understanding of my childhood rearranged itself into a pattern I'd never seen because I'd been looking at it from the wrong angle. My mother hadn't been cold and indifferent. She'd been terrified and trapped, sacrificing her relationship with me to keep me safe from a man whose cruelty I'd somehow never fully witnessed because I'd been too busy feeling invisible. I spent the entire night reading and rereading my mother's diary, unable to sleep, unable to stop watching 37 years of pain rearrange itself into a pattern I'd never seen because I'd been looking from the wrong angle. Dawn arrived cold and gray through my windows, finding me still on the couch, surrounded by tissues, my eyes swollen from crying. The journal opened to an entry about my 13th birthday, where my mother had written, "I wish I could tell her I'm proud of her every single day. Instead, I have to pretend she's invisible. It's destroying me." I'd spent decades believing both parents had rejected me equally, but the diary showed only one true villain. My father had been the architect of every cruelty, and my mother had been another victim making terrible choices under duress, but never stopping loving me, even when she couldn't show it. The entries contained small acts of secret defiance I'd never known about. Patricia had kept every school award I'd ever won, every newspaper clipping about my achievements hidden in a box in the attic where Richard wouldn't find them. She'd anonymously donated $5,000 to my college scholarship fund through an intermediary, money she'd saved from grocery budgets over 2 years. She'd followed my career online for years, reading every article about my developments, saving photographs from charity events, proud but unable to reach out without triggering Richard's rage. She'd been there in the shadows of my life all along, watching me succeed, grieving that she couldn't be part of it. At 7 in the morning, I called my mother's cell phone. She answered on the first ring, her voice hoarse. "Did you read it?" I could barely speak past the tightness in my throat. "All of it. We need to talk. Come to my apartment now." She arrived within 40 minutes, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking like she hadn't slept either. I let her in and we stood in my living room facing each other, two women carrying decades of accumulated pain, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw my mother cry openly, without trying to hide it or stop it. Patricia explained everything with brutal honesty, holding nothing back. She described how Richard's controlling behavior had escalated slowly over years, starting with criticism and isolation, and eventually including threats that terrified her into compliance. He'd controlled their finances, completely checking every receipt, monitoring every dollar, making it financially impossible for her to leave. He'd threatened repeatedly that if she ever tried to take the children, he'd use his connections to paint her as unstable, that he'd make sure she never saw us again. She'd believed him because she'd seen him destroy other people who crossed him, had watched him systematically ruin his former business partner's life as revenge for a perceived slight. "I made the wrong choices," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you and Emily by staying, by obeying him, by creating distance between us so his anger wouldn't focus on you. I see now I just taught you both that abuse was normal, that love looked like neglect, that mothers don't fight for their daughters. I'm so sorry, Felicia. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just need you to know I always loved you, every single day. Even when I couldn't show it, even when you thought I'd forgotten you, I loved you so much it physically hurt." Our conversation lasted 4 hours, moving from my living room to my kitchen and back, coffee growing cold in mugs we forgot to drink from. I asked every difficult question I'd carried for decades. Why didn't she leave earlier? Why didn't she protect me more? Why did she let him treat me like I was worthless? Patricia answered each question honestly, admitting that fear wasn't an adequate excuse that she'd failed me as a mother, even if she'd succeeded at the grim task of surviving. She acknowledged that her silence had damaged me in ways that loving me secretly couldn't repair, that intentions didn't erase impact. I felt myself pulled in opposite directions. Part of me wanted to embrace my mother, to grieve together for the relationship we'd been robbed of, to start rebuilding immediately. But another part, the part that had carried 37 years of feeling unloved, couldn't immediately erase that pain, just because I now understood its source. I looked at my mother and said carefully, "I believe you. I believe the diary is real, and that you suffered, and that you loved me even when I couldn't see it. But I'm not ready to let you back into my life completely. Trust has to be rebuilt piece by piece, and that takes time. We can start by you moving forward with your divorce, by you standing up to Dad publicly, by you showing me through actions, not just words, that you've changed." Patricia nodded, accepting these terms without argument. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes for however long it takes. I've already rented my own apartment, a small place across town. I hired a divorce attorney last week, a woman who specializes in domestic abuse cases. I'm filing papers next Monday. I'm ready to finally leave Richard, even if it means he destroys me financially and socially. I should have done this 30 years ago. I'm doing it now." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decades settling between us. I felt grief for the mother-daughter relationship we should have had, rage at my father for stealing it from us, and a tentative, fragile hope that maybe we could build something new from these ruins. Patricia stood to leave, gathering her coat, and I walked her to the door. Just as she reached for the handle, she turned back with an expression that made my stomach drop. "There's one more thing you should know," she said, her voice suddenly urgent. "Your father's old business partner from years ago, Victor Blackwell, he's been coming around again recently. I didn't understand why until I read about your investigation into Emily's situation. Richard owes him money, a lot of it from some failed investment scheme they partnered on 5 years ago. Blackwell has been threatening to collect from our daughters if Richard can't pay. He specifically mentioned you by name, said you'd built something worth taking. Felicia, I think you might be in actual danger. Richard knows about your success now, and he's desperate enough to let Blackwell target you to settle his own debts." After my mother left, I immediately called my investigator and attorney, instructing them to dig deeper into Victor Blackwell's activities over the past 5 years. Within 24 hours, I had a comprehensive dossier that revealed the true scope of his obsession with destroying me. Blackwell hadn't just been nursing a grudge about losing his country club. He'd been systematically orchestrating a multi-year campaign targeting every aspect of my life and business. The fake journalist who'd approached Emily was just one move in a larger strategy. My investigator uncovered anonymous complaints filed against my company with regulatory agencies, all signed with different names but traced back to IP addresses Blackwell controlled. There were rumors spread deliberately among my business associates about questionable practices, whispered suggestions that my success was built on shortcuts and deception. Attempts to poach my clients by offering suspiciously detailed information about my projects that only someone conducting surveillance could know. He'd even tried to bribe 2 of my key employees to sabotage developments from the inside, though they'd reported the approaches to David immediately. Blackwell had orchestrated Jason's extortion of Emily with surgical precision, identifying my sister's vulnerability through the same investigator who'd found her affair partner, then connecting Jason to resources and strategies designed to maximize damage. It wasn't about money. Every action was calculated to destabilize my family relationships, destroy my reputation, and force me into financial crisis that would allow him to swoop in and reclaim the country club at bankruptcy auction. He was a predator who'd spent decades exploiting people's weaknesses, perfecting techniques of manipulation and destruction, and now he'd fixated completely on taking me down as his final masterpiece of cruelty. My investigator's report included a detailed history of Blackwell's original crime against my father, information I'd never fully understood until now. 25 years ago, Richard Hart's manufacturing business had been genuinely successful, growing steadily, earning respect in the local business community. Blackwell had approached him at a Chamber of Commerce event, presenting himself as a wealthy investor, interested in helping small businesses expand. He'd gained my father's trust over months of dinners and golf games, studying the business from the inside, identifying vulnerabilities and dependencies. Then he'd systematically sabotaged everything. He'd stolen my father's 3 largest clients by offering deals below cost that he could sustain temporarily through other revenue streams. He'd spread false rumors about product quality defects that never existed, rumors that reached industry publications and damaged Richard's reputation. He'd bribed key suppliers to break contracts, leaving my father unable to fulfill orders, which triggered penalty clauses that drained his cash reserves. When Richard's company finally collapsed under the coordinated assault, Blackwell had been positioned perfectly to buy the assets for a fraction of their value, then immediately resold them at massive profit to competitors he'd secretly partnered with. My father had been so completely humiliated and psychologically destroyed by the betrayal that he'd never recovered. The confident businessman became bitter, paranoid, controlling, unable to trust anyone, and desperate to control everything within reach. In a twisted way, Blackwell had created the family dysfunction that had shaped my entire childhood. He'd turned my father into the monster who'd terrorized his own family, and now he was targeting the daughter who'd escaped that toxicity. The most disturbing revelation came near the end of the investigator's report. Blackwell had known my real identity when I'd purchased the country club from him 3 years ago. One of his associates had recognized my name during due diligence and alerted him that Richard Hart's estranged daughter was the buyer. Blackwell had sold me the property deliberately at what seemed like a reasonable price because it was drowning in hidden debt and legal problems he'd meticulously concealed during the sale process. Environmental violations he'd buried in old paperwork, deferred maintenance that would require millions to address, contractual obligations to vendors that would come due immediately after closing. He'd expected me to fail within the first year, to be crushed by the financial burden, to lose everything, and be forced to sell back to him at an even lower price, completing his revenge against the Hart family by destroying both father and daughter. When I'd succeeded instead, when I'd somehow navigated every hidden trap and turned the club not just profitable, but prestigious, his obsession had transformed from calculated cruelty into something darker and more personal. According to intercepted emails my investigator had obtained through methods I chose not to examine too closely, Blackwell had become enraged that a woman, specifically Richard Hart's daughter, had beaten him at his own game. He'd spent the past year plotting comprehensive revenge that would destroy my business, my reputation, my family relationships, and my financial security simultaneously. This wasn't just business anymore. This was a genuinely dangerous man fixated on crushing someone who represented everything he hated about a world that no longer rewarded his particular brand of ruthless manipulation. I realized with cold clarity that this situation extended far beyond my personal grievances with my family. Blackwell was a genuine threat to everyone I cared about, to my employees who depended on my business for their livelihoods, to Emily and Sophie, who'd been weaponized in his schemes, even to my mother, who was finally trying to escape the dysfunction he'd helped create. I needed to stop him permanently, legally and publicly, in a way that would prevent him from ever targeting anyone again. But confronting him directly would be dangerous. He'd spent decades perfecting strategies of destruction and had resources I couldn't match in a straight fight. I needed a comprehensive strategy that would neutralize him completely while protecting everyone he might target in retaliation. I was strategizing with David and my attorney when my phone rang with my lawyer's number. I answered on speaker. "Felicia, we've found it," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Documented proof that Blackwell committed fraud during the club sale. We have bank records showing he diverted club funds into personal accounts right before closing environmental reports. He deliberately withheld vendor contracts. He forged signatures on to make them appear satisfied when they weren't. We have him cold. This is enough to file criminal charges and civil suits that would bankrupt him and possibly put him in prison. I felt relief flood through me, but then she continued in a different tone. But there's a significant complication. Blackwell filed a lawsuit 2 days ago claiming that you defrauded him during the purchase, alleging that you concealed your identity as Richard Hart's daughter to gain unfair advantage, that you manipulated financial documents, and that you've been operating the club illegally. It's completely fabricated, but he's filed it in a jurisdiction where he has connections, and the hearing is scheduled for 72 hours from now. If we don't respond perfectly with ironclad documentation, you could lose everything, and the fraud charges we want to bring against him become much harder to prove. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of focused intensity I'd only experienced a few times in my career, assembling a legal team that worked around the clock preparing for the hearing. My lead attorney brought in forensic accountants who specialized in uncovering financial fraud document analysts who could prove alterations and forgeries, and investigators who tracked down every piece of evidence we'd need. But the most important work involved reaching out to Blackwell's other victims, people he'd destroyed over decades, who'd been too intimidated or broken to fight back. My investigator had identified over 20 small business owners who'd suffered the same systematic sabotage my father had experienced, all following Blackwell's signature pattern of gaining trust, identifying vulnerabilities, and orchestrating collapse while positioning himself to profit from the wreckage. I called each victim personally, explaining who I was and what I was trying to do. Many were initially reluctant, afraid that Blackwell would retaliate even after all these years, traumatized by memories of losing everything they'd built. But when I explained that we had documented evidence, that we had strength in numbers, that this was finally a chance to hold him accountable, something shifted. A woman named Margaret Chen, who'd lost her restaurant chain 15 years ago, agreed to testify. A man named Thomas Rodriguez, whose construction company had been destroyed, agreed to provide financial records he'd kept all these years. One by one, they joined our case, and what had started as my personal legal battle transformed into something larger. This was about finally stopping a predator who'd operated with impunity for decades, exploiting legal loopholes and intimidating victims into silence. The hearing took place in a sterile courtroom that smelled of old wood and anxiety, packed with people who had stakes in the outcome. Blackwell sat at the plaintiff's table, looking confident and expensive in a tailored suit, his attorney beside him projecting the kind of casual arrogance that came from winning more cases than they lost. My team occupied the defendant's table with boxes of evidence stacked behind us. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her 60s known for her sharp mind and zero tolerance for manipulation. Blackwell's attorney opened by painting me as a vindictive businesswoman who couldn't accept legitimate competition, claiming I'd knowingly purchased a troubled property and now wanted to blame the seller for my own poor due diligence. He suggested I was using my family's estrangement from my father as leverage to create a false narrative of victimhood, that my success had made me arrogant and litigious. It was a compelling performance designed to make me look petty and opportunistic. But my attorney's response was methodical and devastating. She presented emails recovered from Blackwell's company servers showing he'd known about every single financial problem with the club before the sale. Messages to his accountant discussing how to bury the environmental violations deep enough that basic due diligence won't catch them. Instructions to his property manager to make sure the deferred maintenance reports don't make it into the disclosure packet. Testimony from 3 of his former employees who'd been instructed directly to conceal issues from potential buyers. Forensic analysis proving that financial statements had been systematically altered, with the originals showing losses while the versions provided to me showed modest profits. Then we presented the pattern. Margaret Chen testified about losing her restaurant chain after Blackwell sabotaged her supplier relationships. Thomas Rodriguez described watching his construction company collapse under the weight of false regulatory complaints Blackwell had filed anonymously. One after another, victims told their stories, and a clear picture emerged of a man who'd spent decades perfecting techniques of destruction, always operating just barely within legal boundaries, exploiting systems designed to protect business rather than people. The turning point came when my attorney revealed Blackwell's connection to Emily's situation, presenting phone records and emails showing he'd orchestrated Jason's extortion scheme and the fake journalist's attack specifically as retaliation against me. "This isn't about business competition," my attorney stated clearly. "This is about a man who became enraged that someone he'd tried to destroy not only survived, but thrived. He spent the past year systematically attacking Miss Hart's family, her reputation, and her livelihood because she succeeded where he expected her to fail. This lawsuit is simply another weapon in that campaign." Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from professional skepticism to visible disgust as the evidence accumulated. But the moment that seemed to crystallize everything came when the courtroom doors opened, and my father walked in looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. Patricia had somehow convinced him to testify, and he approached the witness stand with visible reluctance. His voice shook as he described what Blackwell had done to his business 25 years ago, how the systematic betrayal had destroyed not just his company, but his entire sense of self. "I became a terrible man because of what he did to me," Richard said, his eyes filled with tears. "I hurt my family. I drove away my daughter. I ruined every relationship that mattered because I was so broken by his betrayal that I couldn't trust anyone or value anything except control and appearance. He didn't just destroy my business. He destroyed my soul, and I let that destruction spread to everyone around me." It was the first time I'd ever heard my father take genuine responsibility for his behavior without deflection or justification. I sat there watching him cry in the witness box, feeling complicated emotions I couldn't fully name. Judge Morrison didn't deliberate long. She ruled from the bench with a clarity that left no room for appeal. "Mr. Blackwell's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the overwhelming evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and orchestrated harassment presented today, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney for Criminal Prosecution. Bailiff, please take Mr. Blackwell into custody pending formal charges." Blackwell's face went from confident to ashen in seconds as the bailiff approached. He looked at me across the courtroom with pure hatred, but there was fear there too, the fear of someone who'd finally been caught after decades of avoiding consequences. Outside the courthouse, winter sun breaking through clouds after days of gray, I stood with my legal team accepting congratulations and fielding questions from journalists who'd somehow caught wind of the dramatic hearing. I was exhausted and relieved and still processing everything that had happened when I saw my father standing awkwardly near the courthouse steps, clearly wanting to approach, but uncertain if he'd be welcomed. He looked diminished in a way that went beyond physical aging, like testifying had cost him something fundamental. He took a few hesitant steps toward me. "Felicia, can we talk? I know I don't deserve 5 minutes of your time, but there are things I need to say while I still have the courage." I looked at my father standing on the courthouse steps, visibly gathering courage to approach me, and felt no triumph in his diminishment. Part of me wanted to walk away to preserve the clean victory I'd just achieved in court, without complicating it with this conversation. But another part, the part Marcus had cultivated, knew that avoiding difficult conversations was its own form of cowardice. I nodded once, gestured toward the building, and my father followed me back inside to a small conference room the court staff allowed us to use. Patricia appeared from wherever she'd been waiting, and I was grateful for her presence as a witness and buffer. We sat across a plain table from each other, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Richard looked at his hands at the table anywhere but directly at me. When he finally began talking, his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. "I was wrong about everything. I destroyed our family because I was too weak to deal with my own failures. What Blackwell did to me broke something fundamental inside, and instead of getting help or healing, I infected everyone around me with my bitterness and rage. I took out my pain on people who loved me, especially you, because you were there and you were vulnerable, and I could. He explained with more self-awareness than I'd ever heard from him that my intelligence and capability had reminded him constantly of his own inadequacy. Every achievement of mine had felt like an implicit criticism of his failures. Instead of being proud of having raised a capable daughter, he'd felt threatened and had systematically tried to diminish me to convince me and everyone else that my successes didn't matter, that I wasn't special, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he chose to give. "It was psychological abuse," he said bluntly. "I can call it what it was now, even though I couldn't see it then. I was abusing my own daughter because I hated myself and couldn't admit it." Then Richard revealed something I'd never known. After his business had collapsed, and I'd been left drowning in the debt he'd manipulated me into co-signing, he'd watched from a distance as I'd struggled and survived. He'd known I was working 3 jobs, living in that terrible apartment, eating ramen to afford rent. He'd seen me claw my way out of the hole he'd helped dig. He'd tracked my career online, read articles about my first successful development project, watched as I'd built a life and business that eclipsed anything he'd ever accomplished. I was proud and terrified in equal measure. Richard admitted, his voice breaking. Proud because you became everything I couldn't be, strong and successful and respected. And terrified because it proved I'd destroyed my relationship with an extraordinary person for absolutely no good reason except my own weakness. He revealed he'd tried to reach out twice over the years. Once, when I'd graduated from Stanford, he'd written a congratulations card and addressed it, but never mailed it because he couldn't figure out what to say that wouldn't sound hollow. Once, when Marcus had died, he'd driven to the funeral but sat in his car in the parking lot for 2 hours, unable to enter, knowing that seeing him would make my grief worse rather than better. "Your mother stopped me from reaching out more than that," Richard said, glancing at Patricia. "She told me I'd do more damage, that I couldn't handle seeing you without trying to take credit for your success or diminish your achievements to make myself feel better. She was right. I couldn't have been there for you genuinely. I would have made it about me somehow, my pain, my feelings, my need for validation. I was still too broken to be the father you deserved." Richard didn't ask for forgiveness, which surprised me. He looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down and said clearly, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm asking only that you understand. My behavior was never about your inadequacy. It was always about mine. You were always enough, Felicia, more than enough. You were extraordinary from the day you were born, and I couldn't handle that. A good father would have celebrated having a brilliant, capable daughter. I was too damaged to do that." Tears were streaming down his face now, and he made no effort to hide them. "I'm sorry for every birthday I ruined, for every achievement I ignored or minimized, for every time I made you feel invisible or worthless, for using you as a financial tool and then abandoning you to debt I'd created, for choosing status and appearance over having an actual relationship with you. You deserved a father who saw you and celebrated you and protected you. Instead, you got me a bitter, broken man who destroyed the best thing in his life because he was too damaged to recognize its value until it was gone." I sat listening to this confession, feeling grief and relief washing through me in alternating waves. Grief for the relationship we could have had if he'd been capable of being a real father. Relief that he finally understood, finally saw what he'd done, even though that understanding came decades too late to change anything fundamental. I looked at this diminished man across from me and felt complicated emotions I couldn't easily name. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding that hurt people, that his cruelty had come from his own unhealed wounds, that I could acknowledge his humanity without excusing his choices. "I appreciate this conversation," I said carefully. "I appreciate that you're taking responsibility and not making excuses. But you need to understand that this doesn't erase what happened. 37 years of pain don't disappear because you finally apologized. I'm not ready to have a relationship with you. Maybe someday I will be. Maybe never. You'll have to live with that uncertainty the same way I had to live with the uncertainty of never knowing if my own father loved me." Richard nodded, accepting this without argument. "I understand. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. You owe me nothing." We stood to leave the conversation clearly over, and as we reached the door, Richard pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. His hands shook slightly as he held it out to me. "This is a letter I wrote you 10 years ago but never sent. I found it last week while packing my things to move out. Read it or don't read it, keep it or burn it. It's your choice now, as everything should have been all along." I took the envelope without looking at it, slipped it into my bag and walked out of the conference room, leaving my father standing there with my mother, two people trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives from rubble they'd spent decades creating. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, moving from room to room as I carried it and set it down, unable to open it but unable to throw it away. I'd pick it up in the morning while making coffee, then leave it on my desk at work, then bring it home and place it on my nightstand. Finally, late on the third night when I couldn't sleep, I sat on my couch with a glass of wine I wouldn't finish and carefully opened the yellowed envelope. The letter inside was dated exactly 10 years ago, written in my father's precise handwriting on plain white paper that had aged slightly, the edges soft with time. "Dear Felicia," it began. "Today I learned you paid off the entire debt I left you with. Patricia told me accidentally during an argument about money, not realizing I didn't know. You're 27 years old, and you've already accomplished more than I ever did in my entire life. I should call you. I should tell you I'm proud. Instead, I'm writing this letter I'll never send because I'm a coward who can't face his own daughter." The letter detailed his awareness that he'd been a terrible father, his shame about manipulating me into co-signing debt and then abandoning me to it, his inability to apologize face-to-face because seeing my disappointment would confirm everything he already believed about himself. But the revelation that shocked me most came in the second paragraph. For years, he'd been secretly following my career, attending my presentations anonymously at industry conferences, sitting in the back row where I wouldn't notice him. He'd read every article about my developments, saved clippings about my projects, watched from a distance as I succeeded in ways he'd told himself I never would. "I was at your presentation at the National Development Conference in Chicago," he wrote. "You were 25 and you spoke about sustainable urban renewal with such confidence and intelligence that people twice your age were taking notes." I sat in the back row and cried. Not because I was proud, though I was, but because I realized I had absolutely nothing to do with your success. You became extraordinary despite me, not because of me, and that truth was unbearable. The letter explained his twisted logic with painful clarity. He'd convinced himself that by staying away and staying silent, he was actually helping me. "I told myself you were better off without me, that my presence would only corrupt your success the way I corrupt everything I touch. I see now that was just another excuse to avoid accountability. The truth is simpler and more selfish. I was terrified to face you because seeing my daughter's disappointment was harder than living with my own failures. It was easier to be absent than to risk your rejection." He'd written about specific moments he'd almost reached out. My 30th birthday, when he'd picked up the phone and dialed half my number before hanging up. When Marcus had died, when he'd driven to the cemetery but couldn't bring himself to approach me at the graveside. When I'd bought my first major property, a warehouse conversion project that had been featured in the business section. Each time he'd convinced himself I'd reject him if he tried, so he'd protected himself by never trying, choosing his own comfort over giving me the chance to decide for myself whether I wanted contact. "I watch Patricia looking at your photos online when she thinks I'm not watching," he continued. "She'll pull up articles about your projects and stare at your picture, her face full of grief I caused. I see Emily scrolling past your social media profiles pretending she doesn't have an older sister because I taught her that pretending is easier than being honest. I've created a family built entirely on lies and avoidance, where love exists but can't be expressed, where everyone is damaged by everyone else, where we all protect ourselves by hurting each other first." The final paragraphs were particularly painful to read. I realize now at 47 years old that I destroyed the one person who might have actually saved me if I'd let her. When you were young, before I became too bitter to see clearly, You looked at me like I was a hero. You believed I could do anything. If I'd been brave enough to let you help me after the business collapsed, if I'd been humble enough to accept support from my own daughter, maybe I could have healed instead of festering. But I was too proud to admit weakness to someone I'd spent years trying to convince was weak herself. The irony is obvious and pathetic. He wrote about watching me rebuild after he'd destroyed my credit, seeing me work multiple jobs and still maintain dignity, witnessing my transformation from the invisible daughter into someone genuinely respected in her field. You were the strong one, Felicia. You were always the strong one. I just couldn't admit that strength came from you, from some core of resilience that existed independent of anything I taught you. In fact, you were strong despite everything I did to break you. That should have made me proud. Instead, it made me feel obsolete and threatened, so I convinced myself your strength didn't matter, that you were still somehow less than. What a waste. The letter concluded with words that felt both insufficient and honest. If you're reading this someday, probably after I'm dead, since I'll never have the courage to send it while I'm alive, know that my greatest regret isn't the business I lost, or the money I wasted, or the opportunities I squandered. It's the daughter I threw away. You deserved so much better than me. You deserved a father who saw you and celebrated you and protected you. Instead, you got a broken man who confused cruelty with strength, who mistook control for love, who destroyed beautiful things because he couldn't create anything beautiful himself. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't matter, but I'm sorry. I sat there reading and rereading those pages until the words blurred, crying. Not because the letter changed anything fundamental, but because it confirmed what I'd always suspected. My father had been aware of his cruelty all along. He'd known what he was doing, had understood on some level that he was destroying his relationship with his daughter, and had chosen it anyway because facing his own failures was harder than inflicting those failures on someone else. He'd lived with guilt that never quite transformed into change awareness, that never quite became action. He'd known everything and done nothing, which somehow felt worse than if he'd been genuinely oblivious. The next morning, my phone rang at 6:30 with my mother's number. I answered groggily, still exhausted from staying up reading the letter. Patricia's voice was shaking. Felicia, Richard collapsed last night. He's in the hospital. The doctors say he's had a major heart attack. They did emergency surgery, but there were complications. They're not sure he'll survive the night. You should come if you want to say goodbye. I drove to the hospital through morning traffic, still wearing yesterday's clothes, my mind churning with conflicting emotions about whether I even wanted to see my father one last time. Part of me felt obligated by social convention, by the expectation that daughters appear at dying fathers' bedsides regardless of history. Another part wondered if my presence would be a kindness or just another opportunity for disappointment. I parked in the visitor lot and sat in my car for 10 minutes, before finally forcing myself inside. Richard's room was in the cardiac intensive care unit, a sterile space filled with beeping monitors and the mechanical rhythm of machines helping him breathe. He looked small and frail against the white sheets, diminished in a way that went beyond physical illness. Patricia sat in a chair beside his bed, exhausted and red-eyed, still wearing the same sweater she'd had on at the courthouse. When Richard saw me enter, tears immediately began streaming down his face, though he made no sound. I pulled a chair from the corner and sat across from him, and we looked at each other in silence for what felt like a very long time. Richard spoke first, his voice weak and raspy from the oxygen tube. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that, and I know it. I'm just grateful you came. Your mother showed me something yesterday. He glanced at Patricia, who pulled a small notebook from her bag. My childhood diary, the one I'd thought was lost decades ago. You wrote in here when you were 10 years old. One day they'll realize what they lost. You were right, Felicia. I realized it. I just realized it far too late to matter. Then he revealed something I hadn't known, his voice getting weaker as he pushed through the confession. My investigators' deep dive into Blackwell had uncovered evidence Richard had been hiding for 25 years. When Blackwell had first sabotaged his business, Richard had actually discovered proof of criminal fraud documents showing Blackwell had bribed suppliers and forged contracts. He'd had the weapon to fight back to expose Blackwell and possibly save his company. But Richard had been too ashamed and broken to use it, too psychologically destroyed to fight. He'd hidden the evidence in a safe deposit box and essentially protected the man who'd ruined him. "I was pathetic," Richard admitted, his voice cracking. "Even when I had the power to fight back, I was too weak to use it. I let him destroy me, then I turned around and destroyed my own family because I couldn't handle my failure." He looked directly at me with eyes that held nothing but exhausted honesty. "You're not like me, Felicia. When Blackwell came after you, you fought. You gathered evidence, built a case, stood up in court, and won. You're everything I should have been, but wasn't. That evidence I kept hidden all these years, I gave it to your attorney anonymously before the hearing. It was the first truly selfless thing I've done for you in decades." I sat there processing this revelation, understanding now why my legal case had been so airtight, why we'd had documentation going back 25 years. My father had finally, at the very end, done one thing right. It didn't erase the decades of wrong, but it was something. I leaned forward and told him what I'd needed to say for years, what I'd practiced saying to my therapist, but never thought I'd have the chance to voice to him directly. "I don't hate you, Dad. I actually feel sorry for you. You had a family who could have loved you if you'd let them. You had a daughter who worshipped you when she was young, who would have forgiven almost anything if you'd just shown her basic affection. But you were so consumed by your own pain that you couldn't see what you had until you'd destroyed it." I felt tears on my own face now. "I hope you find peace. But I need you to know something. I found mine without you. I built a life, a business, a sense of self-worth that you tried to destroy but couldn't. That's not despite you or because of you. It's independent of you. You didn't make me weak, but you also don't get credit for making me strong. I did that myself." Richard nodded slowly, accepting this truth without argument or deflection. He was too close to death for ego or self-protection. He asked only one thing, his voice barely above a whisper. "The country club, your success, all of it. Please don't let my rejection of you keep your mother and sister from being part of your life. They need you, and maybe you need them too. I'm the cancer in this family. When I'm gone, maybe you can all finally heal." I made no promises because I couldn't honestly make them yet. But I reached out and held his hand as his eyes closed and his breathing became more labored. I sat there for another hour while he slept, giving him that small mercy of not dying alone. Richard died 2 days later on New Year's Eve, as the world prepared to celebrate new beginnings. Patricia called me at 11 in the evening to tell me he'd passed peacefully in his sleep. We wrote his obituary together over the phone, and I insisted on one thing: the truth. Richard Hart is survived by his wife Patricia, daughters Felicia and Emily, and granddaughter Sophie. He spent most of his life running from his mistakes. At the end, he finally stopped long enough to face them. May he find in death the peace he couldn't find in life. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't the sanitized fiction most obituaries told. It was honest, which felt like the only real tribute worth giving a man who'd spent decades avoiding honesty until his final days. 18 months after my father's death, the Hart estate hosted a special holiday event that felt nothing like the Christmas gatherings of my childhood. This was a New Year's celebration focused deliberately on new beginnings, on looking forward rather than backward, on building rather than mourning. I stood in the main ballroom watching guests arrive, elegant and happy, but my attention kept returning to my mother, working near the registration table. Patricia looked different now, lighter somehow, wearing a simple navy dress instead of the expensive designer clothes she used to favor. She was coordinating volunteers for the domestic violence shelter, where she now worked full-time, explaining procedures to the staff she'd brought with her to help manage the event. My mother had spent the past year rebuilding herself in ways I'd never expected. She'd started therapy immediately after Richard's funeral, attending sessions twice weekly with a trauma specialist who helped her understand how decades of abuse had shaped her choices. She'd gone back to school taking courses in social work and nonprofit management, rediscovering interests she'd abandoned during her marriage. She'd reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with over the years, people Richard had systematically isolated her from. Most importantly, she'd learned who she was outside of being Richard Hart's wife. Outside of the role she'd performed for so long, she'd forgotten it was a performance. Patricia and I had dinner together once a month now, carefully scheduled evenings, where we talked about everything except the past, unless one of us specifically needed to address something. It wasn't the mother-daughter relationship either of us had dreamed of, but it was honest and real. She'd accepted that she'd lost decades with me and couldn't reclaim them, couldn't erase the pain or pretend it hadn't happened. She could only try to deserve whatever future relationship I was willing to offer, showing up consistently, respecting my boundaries, proving through actions rather than words that she'd changed. Across the room, I saw Emily working with the catering staff, checking details on her tablet, managing the evening with competence I wouldn't have believed she possessed 2 years ago. My sister worked at the Hart estate now as events coordinator, a position I'd offered after she'd completed a year of intensive therapy and financial planning courses. She'd divorced Jason after my attorneys had exposed his extortion attempts and his conspiracy with Blackwell, winning full custody of Sophie when the evidence made Jason's character clear to the family court judge. Emily was learning to be independent for the first time in her life, earning her own salary, making her own decisions, building self-worth that didn't depend on designer clothes or maintaining appearances. Our relationship had rebuilt slowly, awkwardly at first, with me setting clear boundaries and Emily learning to respect them. We'd never be best friends, never have the easy intimacy that some sisters shared. But we were becoming actual sisters, people who showed up for each other without expectation of reward or transaction. When Emily's car had broken down last month, I'd picked her up without hesitation. When I'd had the flu, she'd brought soup and crackers and sat with me watching terrible television. Small gestures that built trust incrementally. Sophie appeared then, running across the ballroom in a red velvet dress, her dark curls bouncing. At 4 years old, she was pure joy, unburdened by the complicated history that shaped the adults around her. She crashed into my legs, shouting, "Aunt Fee!" with absolute delight, and I scooped her up, feeling her small arms wrap around my neck. Sophie didn't know about debt or betrayal or family dysfunction. She just knew she had a mother who loved her, a grandmother who spoiled her, and an aunt who let her spin in circles until she got dizzy. Maybe someday we'd tell her the truth about where we'd all come from. But for now, she existed in innocence we'd all worked hard to create and protect. The evening's main event was the official launch of the Hart Foundation, a nonprofit I'd established using a significant portion of the Hart estate's profits. I'd spent months developing its mission with input from therapists, social workers, and people who'd lived the experiences we wanted to address. The foundation existed to support eldest children from dysfunctional families, offering scholarships for education, mentorship programs connecting them with successful professionals, therapy, resources, and business education that could help them build financial independence. I stepped to the podium as the room quieted, looking out at assembled guests. Hart estate members in elegant clothes sat beside scholarship recipients in their best outfits, some looking nervous, others confident. I'd written and rewritten this speech dozens of times, trying to capture something true without being maudlin or self-pitying. I began speaking, my voice steady, carrying to the back of the room. This foundation exists because I understand what it's like to be the child who's expected to sacrifice everything, receive nothing, and still be blamed when you're not grateful for your own invisibility. I know what it means to work 3 jobs while your sibling gets piano lessons, to have your achievements ignored while someone else's mediocrity is celebrated, to be told that your needs don't matter because you're supposed to be the responsible one. Family shouldn't be a hierarchy where some members matter more than others, where love is rationed based on perceived value or compliance. I looked at the scholarship recipients scattered through the audience, young people carrying burdens they shouldn't have to carry. This foundation exists to tell every overlooked, overburdened, underappreciated eldest child something I wish someone had told me when I was young: you matter. Your needs matter. Your dreams matter just as much as anyone else's. And you don't owe anyone your diminishment. Being born first doesn't make you less deserving of love, support, or opportunity. It doesn't mean you exist to sacrifice for others. You're allowed to want things for yourself. You're allowed to succeed. You're allowed to say no. After the speech, people approached me with stories thanking me for creating something they wished had existed when they needed it. A young woman named Sarah Chen, 19 years old with determined eyes, told me she was the eldest of 4 and had dropped out of college to work and support her siblings. The foundation scholarship would let her go back and finish her degree. I hugged her and told her she was going to do extraordinary things, and I meant it absolutely. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the terrace overlooking the golf course now covered in the first real snow of winter. Patricia and Emily joined me there, hesitant, but welcomed. We stood together in comfortable silence, 3 women who'd survived the same dysfunction in different ways, watching snow transform the landscape. My story isn't just about a broken family or revenge. It's about the strength of firstborn children who are overlooked, about finding yourself and rebuilding life from shattered pieces. If this story resonated with you, share your own experience. Comment below and tell me about the moments you overcame family expectations and societal limitations. Subscribe to the channel to never miss stories about resilience and hope. Every story we share becomes a source of inspiration for those feeling forgotten and unrecognized. Let's create a community where each person's journey matters, where silence is replaced by understanding, and where our past doesn't define our future. Your story, like mine, has the power to transform pain into purpose. So what will your next chapter look like?